Ask a room full of cigar people to name the oldest cigar brands still around today, and the first answers will probably sound Cuban. Cohiba, Montecristo, Romeo y Julieta, Partagás, H. Upmann, and fair enough. Some of those names matter a great deal. Some of them are very old. A few helped define the language of premium cigars. But the oldest verified entry in this research comes from somewhere else. Italy. Yes, really. It is Toscano, the Italian cigar with an origin story that begins in Florence in 1815. The story starts with Kentucky tobacco that had been soaked by rain. Instead of throwing it away, people kept working with it, and somehow that damaged tobacco became something people wanted to keep smoking. 3 years later, in 1818, Toscano reached the market. That is where this episode begins. So, keep one thing in mind from the start. Cigar history is bigger than the usual map. Today, we are following the oldest cigar brands and makers still made, still active, or still meaningfully present in cigar culture. But we are going to move carefully, because cigar history has one trap that appears everywhere. You see, a family tobacco root means one thing. A brand launch means another. A company founding has its own clock. A factory opening has another one. A Cuban legacy date is one kind of date. A Dominican production date is another. And a modern relaunch can keep an older name alive, while changing what that date really means. Think about it this way. One family may have started growing tobacco in Cuba in the 1800s, then become known for cigars made in Nicaragua a century later. Another company may have opened as a cigar retailer in Switzerland, then later became tied to Dominican production. Another name may belong to a Cuban brand that reaches back to the 1800s, while its non-Cuban version is made somewhere else under a different portfolio. So, in this episode, every date gets a label. And when we say 1815, 1834, 1865, 1903, 1968, or 2015, we are building a timeline of old cigar names. And we are trying to keep each beginning honest. Now, let's begin in Italy with Toscano. Again, when people think about the oldest cigar names, they usually go straight to Cuba. And that makes sense. After all, Cuba shaped so much of the premium cigar imagination. The language, the mystique, the factory culture, the old brand names, the idea that a cigar could be something more than rolled tobacco. But, as we touched upon earlier, the oldest verified entry in this research begins somewhere else, in Florence, in 1815. The official Toscano timeline is careful about this. It says there are no certain records for the exact birth of the Toscano cigar. So, we should treat the famous story as the official origin legend. And the legend goes like this. A summer downpour hits Florence. A batch of Kentucky tobacco is left outside. The leaves become completely soaked. At first, that sounds like a disaster. Tobacco was valuable. Wet tobacco could mean loss, waste, and a very expensive mistake. But instead of throwing the leaves away, the factory tried to save what it could. As the soaked tobacco dried, it began to ferment. That's a very important detail, by the way. And so, the tobacco changed. The smell grew strong. The flavor became unusual. The leaves were checked and sorted. The better leaves could be used on the outside. The rest could be used as filler. and because this was not planned as a refined luxury product. The cigars were sold cheaply. That is part of what makes the Toscano origin feel so different from the romantic Cuban stories we usually hear. This was not a grand brand launch either, nor was it a new cigar house announcing itself to the world with polished labels and export ambition. This was a salvage operation that worked. Then, 3 years later, in 1818, Toscano reached the market. The official timeline says the cigar was born by accident in 1815. Then it was put on the market 3 years later. So, that's the supposed date. The same timeline connects that production moment to Ferdinand III, Grand Duke of Tuscany. It also connects it to the Florence manufactory where these fermented cigars were produced. So, in our timeline, Toscano ranks first, as it is an origin date for a cigar type, a style, and a tradition that later became a lasting Italian cigar identity. Next on the list comes Arnaud André. And here, the date trap gets even more interesting. Arnaud André takes us to Germany, with roots in 1817. More specifically, the company history goes back to Gebrüder André Tabakfabrik, a tobacco factory founded in Osnabrück in 1817. The Carlos André brand history names Johann Friedrich Christian André as the founder. It says he laid the foundation for the company on January 30th, 1817. That is a strong old date. But again, we need to ask what kind of date it is. For Arnaud André, 1817 is company history. It is German tobacco company history. It is not a Dominican cigar origin date or the launch date of a modern Dominican handmade long filler brand or the founding of Arnaud André Dominicana. It is the root of a European tobacco and cigar company that later developed across Germany. And a major part of that development leads through the German town of Bunde, which would later become known as a German cigar town. Arnaud André becomes especially important once we reach the 20th century cigar history. Its own company history points to the 1950s and 60s as the period when it broke onto the national scene. The same history connects that growth to changes in German cigar production. One of those changes was the lifting of machinery restrictions in the cigar industry after earlier limits. Handel's Gold became one of the company's major national brands. Then Clubmaster followed in the 1970s, as cigarillos became part of the modern market. Then Arnaud André takes another turn. In the late 1990s, the company's own history points to cooperation with La Aurora, the oldest cigar manufacturer in the Dominican Republic. That gave Arnaud André deeper contact with premium handmade cigars. The company later acquired distribution rights for several important cigar names in Germany. Those names included Toscano, Brick House, and El Baton. So, that creates a fascinating bridge. The oldest entry in our list, Toscano, later connects through Arnaud André distribution. Arnaud André itself carries an 1817 German company root. Then the company expands into premium handmade production in the Dominican Republic. But again, the dates must stay in their lanes. The Dominican chapter begins much later. Arnaud André's official Dominican material says the company decided in 2011 to build a modern cigar factory in Santiago de los Caballeros. It says that since 2015, hand-rolled long filler cigars and 100% tobacco cigarillos have been manufactured there. The same material describes Arnaud André Dominicana as part of the company's premium production world. It connects that Dominican operation to brands such as Carlos Andre Family Reserve, Buena Vista, Montosa, and Parchero. So, Arnold Andre has at least 2 clocks running at once. Actually, make that 3. Clock 1 is 1817. That is the German company route. Clock 2 is 2011. That is the decision to build the Dominican factory. Clock 3 is 2015. That is the date tied to hand-rolled long filler cigar and tobacco cigarillo manufacturing in Santiago. It's beautiful to think about how Arnold Andre sits so neatly after Toscano in the opening movement. Toscano shows us an Italian origin story before the old Cuban brand timeline begins. And Arnold Andre shows us a German company route before we move into the Habanos core. Together, they make the world larger before Cuba enters the frame. This also tells us that cigars were moving through state tobacco systems, European factories, family companies, regional markets, imported leaf, local tastes, and later, global production networks. Then, from here, we can finally walk into the old Cuban core with cleaner eyes, because once Havana enters the story, the names get louder. But as Toscano and Arnold Andre show us, louder does not always mean older. And older does not always mean what people think it means. Now we enter the old Cuban core, and this is where the episode needs to slow down a little. When people hear old Cuban cigar brands, the mind usually jumps to the louder names. It jumps to Cohiba, Montecristo, Romeo y Julieta, Partagás, and H. Upmann. Some of those names absolutely belong in the story. A few of them shape the way the world imagines a premium cigar. But when we rank the current Habanos brands by the earliest supported date, the first Cuban name in this validated list is Por Larrañaga. Habanos gives Por Larrañaga an official founding year of 1834. That places it ahead of Ramón Allones, Punch, H. Upmann, Partagás, Sancho Panza, Hoyo de Monterrey, Romeo y Julieta, Montecristo, and Cohiba. That detail should change how we look at cigar history. Por Larrañaga does not carry the same global fame as Cohiba, nor does it have the same broad cultural footprint as Montecristo, or the instant name recognition of Romeo y Julieta. But in the old Cuban timeline, it stands near the front of the room. The name itself means something like by Larrañaga. A Habanos release note connects its first Havana registration to Ignacio Larrañaga in 1834. That gives the brand one of the cleanest early dates in this part of the episode. And yes, the name remains part of the current Habanos world. However, the main website says nothing about every old Por Larrañaga size still being made today. Nor does it say anything about the brand having the same range, reach, or shelf presence in every market. And that is fine. For this timeline, the supported date and the living Habanos name are enough to give it weight. Sometimes, the brand that feels like a connoisseur's footnote is actually the door into the whole story. Habanos describes Por Larrañaga as carefully crafted and well presented. It also describes the cigars as made totally by hand, using tobacco from Vuelta Abajo in Pinar del Rio. In fact, Vuelta Abajo is one of the recurring names in this episode, as it plays a major part in Cuban tobacco history. Again and again, when old Cuban brands explain their identity, the trail points back to that region. So, Por Larrañaga is here because the brand connects age, presentation, Cuban tobacco geography, and quiet survival. Then comes Ramón Allones, founded in 1837. This one has a stronger personality on the page. Habanos calls Ramón Allones one of the big names in the history of Habanos. It also calls it one of the oldest brands still in production. But Ramón Allones is useful here, as it also tells us something important about cigar packaging. As it was the first Cuban cigar brand to pack Habanos in boxes decorated with labels and stamped with the brand's emblem. So, think about that for a second. Before that kind of presentation, a cigar box could be mostly a container. It was useful. It was practical. It was made to hold and move the product. But once labels, emblems, and decoration become part of the experience, the box starts acting like a stage. So, now the cigar has a face. The smoker is buying rolled tobacco from Cuba. And at the same time, he is also buying a name, a symbol, and a visual promise. In other words, the box begins to say, "Remember this." And that is where cigar culture starts to look more like brand culture, and Ramón Allones sits right inside that change. This part of cigar history beautifully explains to us why old cigar packaging means so much to collectors. The bands, box art, seals, factory labels, and regional edition packaging are all part of how cigar memory survives. It's also worth noting that Ramón Allones uses tobacco from Vuelta Tobacco as well. This brand is known for its full, intense, and complex taste. And then comes punch. Punch is where we have to speak carefully, as the simplified version of history says it was established in the year 1840. In fact, many cigar references use that year. The older source document also treats punch as an 1840 registration point, but the official Habanos brand page uses broader wording. It says punch was founded in the mid-19th century by Don Manuel López of Juan Valle and Company. It also says the brand was created with an eye toward the growing English market. So, perhaps we should not treat 1840 as a hard certainty unless we frame it as a commonly cited registration year. But this actually makes the story more interesting, because punch shows us how early Cuban cigars were already being shaped by foreign demand. After all, the name points toward Mr. Punch, the comic figure linked to British popular culture. At that time, a humorous publication with the same name was in vogue. The box imagery still carries that strange old theatrical energy. Mr. Punch appears with a cigar in hand. Around him are scenes of cigar making. So, the interesting thing about all of this is, punch tells us that by the middle of the 19th century, Cuban cigar identity was already traveling. Havana was producing for export tastes, for foreign humor, for foreign collectors, for foreign buyers who wanted Cuban tobacco wrapped in a story they already understood. And that makes punch one of the earliest examples in this episode of cigar branding as translation. The cigar is Cuban, the cultural hook is British. The box becomes a bridge between them. And this is also where we need to avoid mixing Cuban punch with the non-Cuban punch that exists in another market story. In this section, we are talking about the Cuban Habanos brand. Before H. Upmann enters the room, one old Cuban name needs a different kind of caution. Henry Clay. And this is where the timeline gets messy in a useful way. You see, Henry Clay belongs to the old Cuban century, but it does not belong to the current Habanos portfolio. That is exactly why it holds some kind of importance here. because an old Cuban cigar name can survive into the present through a non-Cuban life. The commonly cited root sites in the 1840s. The old Havana story is usually tied to Julian Alvarez. Some deeper histories add more names, addresses, and factory details. But for this episode, the safest label is simple. Henry Clay is an old Cuban brand root name, and today it lives as a non-Cuban Altadis USA brand. That means the 1840s date belongs to the old Cuban root, and not the modern Dominican or Honduran cigars that carry the name today. And it should not be treated as a current Habanos date. The name itself is part of the story. Now, the story goes, Henry Clay was an American statesman, a Kentucky political figure, a public name that 19th century buyers could recognize. So, just like Punch spoke to a British market through Mr. Punch, Henry Clay spoke toward the United States. The tobacco world was Cuban. The name faced outward. And that tells us something important about old Havana branding. That Cuban cigar culture was already using foreign memory, foreign politics, foreign buyers, and familiar names that could travel before the cigar was ever smoked. Then the story moves through ownership changes, American corporate control, the tobacco trust era, the Cuban Revolution, nationalization, and the slow disappearance of Henry Clay from the Cuban state portfolio. So, the current Habanos list does not carry Henry Clay the way it carries Por Larrañaga, Ramón Allones, Punch, H. Upmann, Partagás, Sancho Panza, or Hoyo de Monterrey. Yet the name did not disappear. By the 1980s, the US trademark Life had returned through Consolidated Cigar. That company later became part of what we know today as Altadis USA. So, Henry Clay now gives us two clocks. Clock 1 is the old Cuban root in the 1840s. Clock 2 is the modern non-Cuban market Life that returns through the United States trademark story. And from there, the name keeps moving. Modern Henry Clay has been tied to Dominican production at Tabacalera de García. It has also moved through Honduran production at Flor de Copan. Some modern releases brought the old name back into the boutique era conversation. Henry Clay Tattoo arrived in 2015 through an Altadis project with Pete Johnson of Tatuaje. Henry Clay's Stock Cut followed in 2016. Rustic Charut moved the story into Honduras in 2018. Then Warhawk arrived in 2019 and gave the name its strongest modern shelf pulse. Even there, the date labels stay separate. So, again, Henry Clay belongs here because it's proof that some cigar names keep burning after the original fire has moved somewhere else. Next comes H. Upmann in the year 1844. Now, this is one of the strongest stories in the entire old Cuban section. Habanos traces the brand to Hermann Upmann. He was a German banker whose love for Habanos led him to settle in Havana in 1844. There, he founded a bank and a cigar factory. And that detail gives the brand a different texture from the others. Unlike the other brands we talked about so far, H. Upmann feels like migration, banking, commerce, and cigar prestige crossing into one another. A German banker arrives in Havana. He builds a financial institution. He also builds a cigar name. The bank eventually disappears, but the cigar brand remains. That line almost writes itself, because it captures the strange endurance of cigar culture. Think about it. The institution meant to handle money is gone. Yet, the box of cigars outlives it. Anyhow, H. Upmann also became known for the medals printed on its boxes. Habanos says the gold medals on H. Upmann packaging came from no fewer than 11 international fairs during the 19th century. So, once again, the box is doing historical work, which is telling us that this brand traveled, this brand competed, this brand won recognition. Then, it carried those marks back into the market. So, H. Upmann gives us another piece of the old Cuban machine. But there is one caution. Today, H. Upmann also exists as a non-Cuban portfolio outside Cuba. That branch is connected to Altadis USA in modern non-Cuban production. It is a separate legal and production story from Cuban Habanos H. Upmann. So, again, when this episode says H. Upmann belongs to 1844, we are talking about the Cuban Habanos legacy date. And then, in 1845 comes Partagás. If H. Upmann is the banker's story, Partagás is the factory story. Habanos says the Partagás factory was created in 1845 by Don Jaime Partagás. For many years, the famous factory stood at number 520 Industria Street. That was right behind Havana's capital, in the heart of the city. Habanos also notes the later factory location at 806 San Carlos Street. In a sort of way, Partagás feels tied to a building. It feels tied to Havana streets. It feels tied to workers' benches, tobacco rollers, and factory sound. It is one of those names where the factory memory almost becomes part of the flavor of the brand. Partagás also shows how the old Cuban cigar world was a city system. Factories sat in real neighborhoods. Workers moved through real doors. Leaf arrived from real regions. Export boxes left through real trade channels. And Partagás became one of the great symbols of that world. Habanos describes Partagás cigars as immediately recognizable for their intense flavor. It also connects the brand with selected tobacco from Vuelta Abajo. The brand has one of the great Vitola families in Cuban cigars. Names like Lusitanias, 898, Serie D No. 4, and Serie P No. 2 became part of the language of serious Habano smokers. And again, as with almost every other Cuban brand out there, there are also non-Cuban Partagás lines in other markets. This old Cuban section, however, is about the Habanos brand and its Havana factory history. And finally, Sancho Panza enters the story with the year 1848. But this date needs the right label too. Habanos says the first registration of the brand dates back to 1848. So, we should call it a first registration date. That may sound like a tiny difference, but in this episode, tiny date differences are the whole point. A first registration is a legal or commercial marker. It tells us the name has entered the record. However, it may not tell us the first day a cigar was sold. It may not tell us the first day it was rolled. It may not tell us the first day it was exported. It may not tell us when smokers first recognized it. So, we use the date. Honestly, Sancho Panza also gives this early Cuban group another literary anchor. The name comes from Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. Sancho Panza is the faithful squire. He is the grounded companion beside Don Quixote's wandering imagination. And that placed the brand inside a much larger habit in cigar history. Cigar makers often borrowed from literature to give tobacco a story before the smoker even opened the box. That's quite significant because Montecristo, which comes much later in 1935, often gets the spotlight for literary cigar branding. But Sancho Panza shows that the habit was older. So, by now, we've come to establish that Cuban cigar branding is not one single thing, as it carries age. It also carries paper, law, geography, export taste, factory memory, literature. It carries the box, the emblem, the label, the building, the market, the region, and the story around the smoke. And this is why the old Cuban core still holds a lot of importance in the cigar world. Even in a global episode that begins in Italy and later moves through Switzerland, Germany, the United States, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Nicaragua, and the modern boutique world, those early Cuban names still hold that very same weight, though perhaps to a lesser degree than the various premium New World cigar brands that have exploded in recent years. And now, the cigar was already becoming a story long before anyone cut the cap. In 1865, Hoyo de Monterrey changes the shape of this timeline. The Hoyo de Monterrey plantation sits in the Vuelta Abajo region, near San Juan A. Martinez in Pinar del Rio. Habanos connects the story to José L, a Spaniard from Tarragona. It also connects the story to the Hoyo de Monterrey plantation. The famous inscription at the plantation gate reads, Hoyo de Monterrey, José L, 1860. That 1860 date is vital, but we should not use it carelessly as the brand's starting point, as it points to plantation identity. The cleaner brand date in this timeline is 1865. That is when the name was first used as a Habanos brand. And Hoyo belongs here because it shows how a cigar can carry a landscape inside its name. You see, the word Hoyo can be understood as a low-lying hollow or a valley-like landform. For cigar viewers, the bigger point is not only a founder's name on a band, but a piece of agricultural geography turned into a cigar identity. That is why Hoyo de Monterrey feels different from a name like H, Upmann or Partagás, as those brands pull us toward people and factories, while Hoyo pulls us toward fields. That same year, 1865, gave us Plasencia. But this is a completely different kind of date. With Hoyo de Monterrey, we are dealing with a Cuban brand name tied to a famous plantation identity. With Plasencia, we are dealing with family tobacco roots. And that difference, it's crucial. The Plasencia story begins with Don Eduardo Plasencia. He left the Canary Islands and began growing tobacco in Vuelta Abajo, Cuba, in 1865. That is the date attached to the family's tobacco story. It is not the launch date of the modern Plasencia cigar brand as smokers know it today. This is where a lot of cigar history gets flattened. Someone sees Plasencia 1865 and assumes the brand on the shelf began in 1865. So, the fair reading is that the Plasencia family's tobacco work goes back that far. On the other hand, the current consumer-facing Plasencia identity came much later. By then, the family had already spent generations as growers, leaf people, and manufacturers. And honestly, that makes the story more interesting. Plasencia is one of the best examples of a family becoming important in cigar history before most smokers ever see the family name on a cigar band. Many cigar smokers first meet a brand as a box, or a band, or a rating. But behind that visible brand, there may be decades of work that most people never see. Growing tobacco, sorting it, curing it, fermenting it, blending it, and manufacturing cigars for other people. For Plasencia, the roots begin in Cuba. The later story moves through exile, disruption, rebuilding, and the new cigar map of the Americas. Over time, the family becomes strongly tied to Nicaragua and Honduras. And eventually, the Plasencia name becomes a front-facing premium cigar brand in its own right. Then, after Plasencia, the timeline moves into the 1870s with Juan López. Juan López is a quieter Cuban name, and that quietness is useful, for as you've learned by now, old cigar brands do not always arrive with a sharp founding year that fits neatly on a title card. Some come to us through a decade, a registration trail, a factory memory, or a surviving brand description. And Juan López belongs to that quieter part of the old Cuban portfolio. Juan López does not carry the same broad public fame as Romeo y Julieta, Montecristo, Cohiba, or Partagás. It is known in smaller circles, for Habanos itself describes it as a brand with loyal followers. Its regular Vitolario is built around Selección number 1 and Selección number 2. And that tells us something about another kind of survival. Some brands stay alive because they dominate the global imagination. Others stay alive because a smaller group keeps caring. Juan López is useful because it belongs to that second category, which shows us that a brand does not need to be loud to be old, nor does it need a massive range to have importance, but rather it can survive through a small set of cigars, a loyal audience, and a place inside the Cuban portfolio that collectors and regular smokers still recognize. It also helps us avoid the usual shortcut where Cuban cigar history becomes only a handful of famous names. So, that shortcut makes the story easier, but it also makes the story smaller. After Juan López keeps us inside the quieter side of the Cuban shelf, the map needs to open again, this time to Brazil. And the name is Dannemann. Dannemann takes us to São Félix, in Bahia, specifically in the Rio Paraguaçu, in the Reconcavo tobacco region. And it gives this episode a cigar country that often gets reduced to a wrapper note. The safest date label is 1872 to 1873. Official company wording points strongly to 1872, when Geraldo Dannemann settled in São Félix and soon built his first cigar factory. Several other accounts use 1873 for the formal company or factory start. The story begins with Geraldo Dannemann, a German from Bremen who found his way to Brazil. That already gives us another one of those cigar history crossings. A German founder, Brazilian tobacco, a river town, a factory, and a region with its own leaf identity. The official company history says the first long filler factory remains in operation today on the banks of the Rio Paraguaçu. And that detail gives Dannemann its strength in this list, because Brazil is often present in cigars without being given the center of the story. Many smokers know Mata Fina. They know Brazilian wrapper. They know dark, fragrant tobacco from blend sheets. But Dannemann lets Brazil stand as a cigar-making place in its own right. The company's story also brings in São Félix, Bahia, the Reconcavo, Mata Fina, Mata Norte, and Fazenda Santo Antonio. Those names mean something because every cigar country has its own geography. Cuba has Vuelta a Baco. Nicaragua has Esteli, Jalapa, and Condega. The Dominican Republic has Santiago, Tamboril, La Romana, and Villa González. And Brazil has Bahia, São Félix, the Reconcavo, and tobacco names that deserve to be heard. The modern Dannemann story has another layer too. The current group is Swiss-based and family-owned. It also carries a Swiss Burger family tobacco business link from 1864. That date belongs to the Burger side of the modern group and should not replace the Brazilian Dannemann route. Again, the clocks stay separate. 1864 belongs to the Swiss group heritage. 1872 to 1873 belongs to Geraldo Dannemann's Brazilian cigar factory story. And today, the portfolio covers handmade Brazilian cigar production, cigarillos, regional brands, farms, factories, and global distribution. That complexity is the point. Dannemann shows that the cigar world was never only Havana, Tampa, Santiago, or Esteli, for Brazil had its own place in the smoke, and São Felix keeps that place visible. Then we arrive at 1875, and two very different sequences appear at the same time. The first is Oettinger Davidoff. This is one of the most important date traps in the whole episode. The Oettinger Davidoff company story begins in Basel, Switzerland in 1875. That is when Max Oettinger opened a specialized cigar store at Eisengasse 9. So, for now, that gives us company roots, and it gives us cigar retail roots. But it does not give us the launch date of the Davidoff cigar brand in the way most modern smokers understand that name. So, we need to slow down here. Oettinger Davidoff is old because the company's foundation is old. Its story begins in European cigar retail, import, distribution, and tobacco commerce. It is a Swiss business story before it becomes the modern Davidoff premium cigar story. That is why Oettinger Davidoff sits differently from the other cigar houses we spoke of already. The later Davidoff story has its own layers. There is Zino Davidoff in Geneva. There are Cuban Davidoff cigars in the 20th century. There is the end of Cuban production. And there is the move into the Dominican Republic. But for this part of the timeline, the key point is that 1875 belongs to Max Oettinger and the Basel Company roots. The Dominican production chapter comes much later. Oettinger Davidoff's current production material says that as of 1991, Davidoff cigars have been handcrafted in the Dominican Republic. That production is tied to the company's manufacturing site in Villa González, Santiago. So, the Dominican Republic is central to the modern Davidoff cigar identity. But 1991 does not reach back and turn 1875 into a Dominican production date. Again, the label protects the story. Now, the second 1875 sequence is Romeo y Julieta. Here, we return to Cuba. Habanos places Romeo y Julieta in 1875 as a Habano brand. Its name comes from Shakespeare's tragedy. And that literary connection holds a strong importance here because it shows how cigar branding was already reaching beyond tobacco language, as the name did not come from a field or from a factory address. No, it came from a story people already knew. And that gave the brand a built-in emotional shape. Love, tragedy, memory, romance, recognition. Those associations travel well. They make a cigar name easier to remember. They make it easier to export. And they make it easier to turn into a cultural object. But Romeo y Julieta's real rise came later. Habanos connects the brand's international renown to the early 20th century. It also connects that rise to Don Pepin Rodriguez. He understood the power of cigar rings and brand identity. So, this detail brings us back to packaging. Earlier, Ramón Allones showed how boxes and labels could help build a cigar brand. Romeo y Julieta shows how cigar rings themselves could become part of a brand's success. This is where cigars become visual culture. The band herein becomes a signal of identity. It tells the smoker what they are holding. It tells the room what the smoker chose. And it gives the brand a memory that lasts beyond the smoke itself. Romeo y Julieta also became strongly linked to Winston Churchill. Habanos notes that Churchill was one of the brand's devoted smokers. After his visit to Havana in 1946, his name became attached to some bands and to the famous Churchill's Vitola. And that connection helped make Romeo y Julieta recognizable around the world. But we need to keep yet another distinction clear. One story belongs to the Cuban Habanos Romeo y Julieta. Another story belongs to the non-Cuban Romeo y Julieta portfolio outside Cuba. That non-Cuban portfolio is distributed by Altadis USA. It includes lines such as Romeo y Julieta 1875, Reserva Real, and others. Again, for viewers, this can get confusing because the name is the same. But the legal story is not the same. The market story is not the same. And the production story is not the same. The Cuban Romeo y Julieta belongs to the Habanos world. The non-Cuban Romeo y Julieta belongs to a separate portfolio. It has its own production identity and its own market identity. So, in this timeline, 1875 belongs to the Cuban legacy brand. But yes, cigar history gets messy when famous names travel across borders. It gets messy through revolutions, through embargoes, through ownership changes in production systems. But a good timeline does not erase that mess. Then, in 1876, Meerapfel brings the story back to Europe, but it comes through a very different door. Meerapfel is here because that date belongs to family cigar-making roots. Cigar Aficionado's coverage describes the Meerapfels as a family that had worked with tobacco for hundreds of years. It describes cigar making in Untergrombach, Germany, beginning in 1876. The family rolled cigars there by hand for roughly 150 years. Then that old European cigar-making story was broken by war. But in the modern premium cigar war, Meerapfel is known most powerfully through leaf, especially Cameroon tobacco. That is why Meerapfel deserves a different kind of treatment in this episode, as this is a story about tobacco growing. It is a story about wrapper supply. It is a story about trade, family memory, and the way one family's work can shape cigars made under other names. After all, Cameroon wrapper has its own place in premium cigar culture, as it is prized for its texture, aroma, and rarity. And the Meerapfel family became deeply associated with preserving and supplying it. Cigar Aficionado credits Richard Meerapfel as a major figure in saving Cameroon tobacco from near extinction. So, that single point gives the Meerapfel entry weight far beyond its current brand visibility. The modern Meerapfel branded cigar lines arrived much later, however. They came as ultra-premium releases tied to family figures and old tobacco reserves. Therefore, the date label remains very important. 1876 means family cigar making roots, not the launch of the current Meerapfel cigar line, or the Cameroon wrapper origin date. Then Mexico has to enter the timeline. And for this episode, Mexico enters through the Torrent family, more specifically through San Andres, Veracruz. This date is 1880, but again, we need the label before we let the date do too much work, as 1880 is a family tobacco root date. It belongs to the Torrent family's tobacco work in San Andres. It is not a launch date of Te Amo. It is not a launch date of Casa Torrent. And it is certainly not a launch date of a cigar called Casa Torrent 1880. Those come later. The family root comes first. The clearest working support comes through Alberto Torrent, explaining that his great-grandfather began growing tobacco in 1880. That gives the Torrent story a strong Mexican tobacco root. And it gives San Andres a proper place in the map, because Mexico is often treated too narrowly in cigar conversation. A smoker sees San Andres on a blend sheet. They think of dark wrapper, earth, sweetness, cocoa, pepper, maybe a certain rustic texture. And that is useful, but it is only part of the story, as San Andres is also a place, a valley, a farming identity, a tobacco language, a family story, and a Mexican answer to a cigar map that too often jumps from Cuba to the Dominican Republic, Honduras, and Nicaragua. The Torrent family helps keep that map honest. Te Amo belongs to the next clock. The date is a little crowded. Some sources use 1964. Alberto Torrent himself used 1966 in interview material, while also mentioning the later 60s. So, the safest phrase is mid-1960s, with 1966 as the strongest interview-supported brand creation date. Te Amo became the great Mexican cigar name for many American smokers. It became tied to New York, to availability, to a Mexican identity that did not try to pretend it was Cuban. And for a time, that meant a great deal. Then Casa Torrent becomes the modern premium clock. The family moves from being known mostly through tobacco and Te Amo into a more refined premium expression under its own name. Trade coverage places the early Casa Torrent release outside the United States in 2013, with a US release in 2015. And then, later, Casa Torrent 1880 turns the family date into a cigar line idea. This is where the date trap becomes visible on the band itself. The 1880 date honors the family tobacco root, but a cigar named for that date comes more than a century later. Anyhow, Casa Torrent then builds its modern story through family date lines, San Andres Tobacco, 1900 series cigars, the 1800 family, and origins expressions that speak to Mexico, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Miami. And that is a fitting modern move, because the cigar world is connected. Mexico speaks to Cuba through seed and memory, to Nicaragua through filler and modern blending, to Miami through market history, and to the Dominican Republic through the wider premium cigar network. Next, we come to the Cuban names of the 1880s. The first is José L. Piedra, and this one needs careful wording, for Habanos describes José L. Piedra as a distinctive Habano. Its blend uses filler tobacco from the Remedios tobacco region, and the cigars are made totalmente a mano, tripa corta. In Spanish, that means totally handmade with short filler. So, right away, José L. Piedra is different from many Cuban names in this list. Most people hear Cuban cigar and think of long filler premium Habanos from the famous Vuelta Abajo story. José L. Piedra, however, gives us another Cuban storyline, as it moves us away from the usual Havana-centered imagination. Habano says the Piedra family came to Cuba in the 1880s from Asturias in Spain. They settled near Santa Clara, which is close to the Remedios tobacco region. The later brand development is linked to José La Madrid Piedra. So, again, The date label has to stay cautious. We can say this entry has an 1880s family and production roots, but we should not call the 1880s a clean brand founding date unless we have a stronger direct registration source. But even with that caution, José L. Piedra adds something important, as it shows that old Cuban cigar history is not only about elite names or grand export brands or the most expensive boxes. This brand includes a more working, practical, volume-oriented side of the Habano world. And yes, short filler handmade cigars are still handmade, but they do not carry the same construction story as long filler cigars, which is a significant distinction that cigar enthusiasts must acknowledge. José L. Piedra also reminds us that Cuban tobacco regions have hierarchy and variety. Vuelta Abajo has the deepest myth and the highest global prestige, but Remedios and Vuelta Arriba have their own place in Cuban tobacco history. So, that makes José L. Piedra useful in a list like this, for it lowers the camera from the famous shelf to the wider workshop. And it shows that survival in cigar history can come through accessibility, volume, and regional identity. And it can come through a different kind of smoker loyalty. Then, in 1882, El Rey del Mundo arrives with one of the boldest names in the old Cuban portfolio. The name means the King of the World. And Habano says the brand was launched in 1882 under Antonio Allones. By then, Antonio Allones had already been producing Habanos in Havana for more than 30 years. So he was already part of Havana cigar production. El Rey del Mundo was launched as a premium quality and premium price brand. The name itself carried a kind of theatrical confidence. The King of the World, which is not a modest name. And by the 1880s, that confidence tells us something about Cuban cigar branding, for the industry had moved beyond basic maker names and was using literature, places, personalities, prestige language, export cues, packaging, and ambition. A brand could now sound like a claim, and El Rey del Mundo is useful because it captures that mood. So, in other words, it is not just saying, here is a cigar. Instead, it says, here is a cigar with status. And besides the quality of the tobacco, that status also depended on the name. It depended on the presentation. It depended on the price positioning. It depended on the reputation of the maker. And it depended on the confidence of Havana's cigar culture in the late 19th century. Habano describes the modern El Rey del Mundo range as selected, light to medium in flavor, and made totally by hand with long filler. The leaves come from Vuelta Abajo in Pinar del Rio. The current range is smaller than the name might make you expect, but the name still carries real history. And this is a pattern we keep seeing in this episode. Some old brands grow louder over time, some become quieter, some survive as specialist names, some become global shorthand. El Rey del Mundo sits somewhere in the middle. It has a grand name. It has a real 1882 launch date, and it still has a place in the Habanos portfolio. But casual viewers may not mention it before the bigger Cuban names. That is exactly what makes it useful here. Because the deeper you go into old cigar brands, the clearer the map becomes. Either way, by this point, cigar history has shown itself as a map of soil, families, trade, memory, and names that kept moving. And now the timeline starts to widen again. Until this point, much of the story has moved through Cuba Europe, family roots, and old Havana names. But in 1884, the United States enters the episode in a more serious way through Cuesta Rey. And Cuesta Rey is a good example of why America belongs in cigar history. The date we are using here is 1884, but the label is essential, as this is a factory-rooted date tied to Angel La Madrid Cuesta and not a simple modern brand launch in the way we might use that phrase today. Cuesta was a Spanish immigrant. He learned the cigar trade through the Cuban world. Then he came to the United States and opened his own cigar factory in 1884. Later, he joined with Peregrino Rey, and the Cuesta Rey name was born. That story places Cuesta Rey inside the Clear Havana tradition. A Clear Havana cigar was not a Cuban cigar made in Cuba, but rather a cigar made in the United States using Cuban tobacco. And that may sound like a small distinction, but in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it held great importance. American cigar cities such as Tampa, Key West, and New York were selling cigars. They were part of the cigar-making world itself, and Tampa, especially, became one of the great cigar cities. Ybor City and West Tampa grew around immigrant labor. They grew around Cuban tobacco knowledge. They grew around Spanish and Cuban cigar families. They grew around lecture culture, factories, unions, cafes, politics, and the daily routine of rolling benches. So, when Cuesta Rey appears in this timeline, it is here because it represents the moment when the cigar story crosses water, language, labor, and tobacco supply chains. Also, there is another detail that gives Cuesta Rey its old world flavor. The brand became associated with the Spanish king Alfonso XIII. But that does not mean we should turn this entry into royal myth. Yet it does show how cigar prestige worked at the time. A cigar could be a factory product. It could be an immigrant business. It could be a tobacco craft object. And it could be a status symbol, all at once. Today, Cuesta Rey sits inside the J.C. Newman world. That becomes important again in a few minutes. Then, still in 1884, we return to Cuba with La Flor de Cano. And this is one of those names that proves the oldest Cuban story is wider than the famous story. La Flor de Cano gives us a more complete view of the Habanos portfolio. So, while some old names survive as giants, others survive in smaller corners. They may have fewer vitolas, they may have lower visibility, they may have a more limited market presence, but that does not make them less useful historically. Sometimes, the smaller brands help us see the full shelf more honestly. However, the 1884 date still needs care, as our research treated this date as a strongly supported date. But it also carried a caution, because the direct Habanos brand page support is not as clean as it is for some other entries. Its modern identity is useful too, because it reminds us that old does not always mean grand, rare, or expensive. The Habanos material presents Flor de Cano as a brand built around a balance between flavor and aroma. It also describes the cigars as Habanos made totally by hand with short filler from Vuelta Abaco. And in case you need us to remind you, short filler means the filler is made from cut pieces of tobacco. It is not made from the full long leaves used in many premium handmade cigars. However, in a collector-heavy conversation, people often treat short filler as less romantic. But historically, short filler is part of the real cigar world. Not every old Cuban name survives in the same production category. not every old Cuban name lives in the same price tier. And not every old Cuban name stays in the same prestige lane. So, La Flor de Cano helps keep the list honest. Then, in 1885, La Gloria Cubana enters the story. And this one is another clean example of the date trap. On the Cuban side, Habanos places La Gloria Cubana in 1885. It describes the brand as a lesser-known jewel among Habano brands. It also points to a long history and a loyal following among knowledgeable smokers. So, that already gives La Gloria Cubana a strong place in the old Cuban timeline. But the name La Gloria Cubana is familiar to many smokers outside the Cuban market too. That is because there is a non-Cuban La Gloria Cubana as well. So, they share a name, they share a historical resemblance. But they should not be folded into one simple identity, as the non-Cuban story is modern, running through Miami, it runs through El Credito, through the Perez Carrillo family. Cigar Aficionado places the original non-Cuban La Gloria Cubana blend in Miami in 1972, at the El Credito cigar factory. We'll talk more about that later, as the non-Cuban La Gloria Cubana became one of the cigars that helped shape the American premium cigar boom, for it became a modern cigar with a following, and it developed a stronger blend profile, earning itself a very real place in the US market. But when this episode says La Gloria Cubana belongs to 1885, that date belongs to the Cuban Legacy brand. A year later, in 1886, Oliva enters the timeline through family tobacco roots. This is another entry where we have to be careful, because many viewers know Oliva as a Nicaraguan cigar name. And that is fair, as Oliva's modern cigar identity is strongly tied to Nicaragua. But the old date in this episode is the beginning of a family tobacco story in Cuba, and not the Nicaraguan company launch, or the launch date of the modern Oliva Cigar Company. Oliva's official company history begins with Melanio Oliva. He started growing tobacco in Pinar del Rio, Cuba, in 1886. But the family story was not a straight line, for Melanio's tobacco work was interrupted when he left the farm to fight against Spain in the Cuban War of Independence. Then, after the war, he returned to farming and resumed cultivation. Later generations carried the tobacco work forward. The modern Oliva company came much later. Its Nicaraguan production identity came much later too. And you'll come to find that many New World cigar names can be modern on the shelf, but they can carry Cuban tobacco roots, and they can be Nicaraguan, Honduran, or Dominican in their production identity. And that layered identity is one of the central patterns of premium cigar history after the Cuban Revolution, which we'll talk more about later. Before Villager brings Switzerland back into the story, one revived Cuban name belongs in the late 1880s conversation, La Aroma de Cuba. And this is one of the cleanest revived name chapters in the whole timeline. The old claim points back to Cuba in the late 1880s, but the current cigar life belongs somewhere else. First to Ashton, then to production by the Garcia family at my Father Cigars in Nicaragua. So, that gives La Aroma de Cuba several clocks. Clock 1 is the late 1880s Cuban origin claim. Clock 2 is the early 2000s Ashton revival. Clock 3 is the move into the Garcia family's Nicaraguan production world in 2008 and 2009. And Clock 4 is the current La Aroma de Cuba portfolio, which has become a full modern Nicaraguan-made family of cigars. So, once again, the old name and the living cigar are connected, but they are not the same clock. And the current cigar is not a current Habanos brand, as it is a non-Cuban revived brand. The old name gives it memory. The modern production gives it life. Ashton brought the name back in the early 2000s. And the first modern La Aroma de Cuba cigars were made in Honduras at Flor de Copan. Then the story changed. Ashton moved the brand toward Jose Pepin Garcia and Jaime Garcia. But ownership stayed with Ashton. Production and blending moved into the My Father Cigars world. Then, in 2008, La Aroma de Cuba Edición Especial became the first major Garcia-made expression under the name. Then, in 2009, the core line was reblended and reintroduced through My Father Cigars production. And that became the La Aroma de Cuba many modern smokers recognize today. In 1888, Villiger brings Switzerland back into the story. The company's official history traces its founding to John Villiger and his wife, Louise Villiger. It begins in Pfäffikon, in the Lucerne region of Switzerland. Their early work started on a small domestic scale. Villiger's Stampen were made in the living room of their house. Which is quite interesting, because when people imagine old cigar history, they often picture Havana factories, Caribbean fields, Tampa rolling rooms. Yet Villiger gives us another setting: a Swiss family business, a small village, a European cigar tradition, and a company that grows across generations. Villiger also helps widen our idea of cigar culture, as Europe was a humongous market for cigars, for it had cigar companies, cigarillo traditions, and it had retail systems, factories, and tobacco families of its own. At the same time, we should not flatten Villiger into one simple handmade premium story, for this esteemed company has a broad tobacco portfolio. And that portfolio includes both machine-made products and handmade lines. Now we reach Fonseca, and here the date gets broad again. Habanos says Fonseca was founded by Don Francisco Fonseca in the last decade of the 19th century. So, that is how we should say it, not 1890 or 1892 or even 1895. Sometimes historical accuracy means refusing to make a date sound cleaner than the source allows. Fonseca is useful for another reason too: its presentation. The brand is known for cigars wrapped in fine tissue paper. In a world where cigar bands, boxes, lithography, seals, and cabinet presentation all became part of cigar culture, Fonseca had its own visual signature. After all, besides the tobacco itself, a cigar has plenty of meaning in how tobacco is presented, how it is protected, how it is handled, how it is gifted, how it is aged, and how it is recognized. Earlier, Ramón Allones gave us the early decorated box conversation, but now Fonseca gives us the individual cigar dressed in its own paper wrapper. That visual detail makes Fonseca memorable, even when the brand is not as famous as the larger global Habanos names. Its blend identity is usually described as light. It too is associated with Vuelta Abajo tobacco. And current Habanos material notes that its vitolas are totally handmade, with some long feeler and some short feeler. Then, in 1895, J.C. Newman gives us one of the clearest old American cigar company stories. And this one should not be rushed. You see, Julius Caesar Newman was a Hungarian immigrant in the United States. The official Newman family history traces the company back to 1895, as that was the year he rolled his first cigars in the family barn in Cleveland, Ohio. And from there, the story becomes one of the strongest American storylines in this episode. In 1954, the Newman family moved to Tampa. That move tied the company to Ybor City and the El Reloj factory. El Reloj means the clock in Spanish. The building was constructed in 1910. J.C. Newman describes it as having been considered one of the largest and finest cigar factories in the world when it opened. Today, the company calls it the last operating cigar factory from Tampa's old cigar era. And that point is important, as Tampa once had a huge cigar manufacturing world. It was called Cigar City for a reason. The factories were the economic and cultural engines of whole neighborhoods. They carried immigrant stories, they carried labor stories, they carried Cuban and Spanish political life, and they carried American cigar manufacturing on a massive scale. Most of those factories are gone now. Many still stand in some form, but no longer operate as cigar factories. El Reloj, however, still does. That is why J.C. Newman gives this episode something rare. It gives us a living bridge between the American cigar industry of the late 19th century and the cigar culture people can still visit today. It also connects back to Cuesta Rey. So, those two entries should not feel entirely separate, as Cuesta Rey gives us the older Clear Havana factory route, while J.C. Newman gives us the active family company structure that carries that older brand story forward inside its portfolio. Then, in 1902, Bolivar enters the Cuban timeline. This is another kind of name entirely. Some cigar names come from founders, some come from farms, some come from factories, some come from novels. The Bolivar cigar brand, on the other hand, comes from a highly influential historical figure in that part of the world. And that figure is Simón Bolívar, remembered as the liberator of much of South America from Spanish rule. Habanos places the creation of the Bolivar brand in 1902. Today, the Cuban Bolivar line is linked to the Partagás factory in downtown Havana. This brand means a lot because Bolivar brings political memory into cigar naming. It carries a public historical reference. It points to independence, power, nation-making, and the 19th century imagination of Latin American identity. But that does not mean the cigar itself is a political lesson. Though the name shows how cigar branding could borrow from history, literature, royalty, geography, family names, and national heroes. Just think about the Cuban cigar brand names we have passed already. Sancho Panza borrows from Spanish literature. Romeo y Julieta borrows from Shakespeare. Hoyo de Monterrey comes from place and plantation identity. El Rey del Mundo sounds like prestige and theater. La Gloria Cubana speaks in national feeling. Bolivar reaches for a continental liberator. They are all part of the storytelling machinery of Cuban cigar culture. And again, the usual date caution still applies, as Cuban Bolivar and any non-Cuban uses of the name should not be confused unless we clearly explain that branch. And then, in 1903, the timeline reaches one of the most important anchors in the whole episode, La Aurora. Now, this is where the Dominican Republic enters the story with a true Dominican origin brand and factory founding. That is why La Aurora deserves more than a passing mention. The official La Aurora history says Eduardo León Jiménez founded the La Aurora cigar factory in 1903. He was 18 years old. The factory was founded in Don Pedro, in the Guazumau community, in the province of Santiago de los Caballeros. So, that gives this entry a very strong date label. Dominican brand and factory founding? Mind you, this is not a Cuban legacy name later produced in the Dominican Republic, or a foreign company with a Dominican production chapter, or a family tobacco root that later becomes a modern brand. No. La Aurora begins in 1903 as a Dominican cigar factory and brand, which makes it a major anchor for our episode. Because the common version of modern premium cigar history often treats the Dominican Republic as if its cigar story rose mainly after the Cuban Revolution, after the US embargo, after famous Cuban families rebuilt their work outside Cuba. Yes, that later story is quite significant. But aside from Cuba, the Dominican Republic did become one of the great homes of premium cigar production in the second half of the 20th century. And La Aurora proves that the Dominican cigar story is older than that. You see, Eduardo León Jiménez was not stepping into a country already understood around the world as a premium cigar powerhouse. Cuba still dominated the imagination. Havana was the great word. Dominican cigars did not yet carry the same international weight. That is what makes La Aurora's 1903 date so meaningful. The company began small, with the official history pointing toward a modest investment. It also points to a dream of creating a handmade cigar brand with global reach. And it notes that the first cigars were perfectos. That was a double figurado format. La Aurora still connects that shape to its identity today. And it's this very shape that gives the brand a visual memory. A perfecto has a shaped body. It has tapered ends, and it follows a more difficult construction logic. So, when La Aurora keeps that format in its story, it is preserving a craft signature. La Aurora also becomes tied to a larger Dominican business story. The company's own history describes it as the seed of what became the A. León Jiménez Group. So, once again, La Aurora gives the Dominican Republic a clear early root in premium cigar history. And when we compare La Aurora to later Dominican-made names, we need to be precise. Arturo Fuente's Dominican chapter is later. Davidoff's Dominican chapter is later. Ashton's Dominican production story is later. Tabacalera de Garcia's scale story is later. Quesada, Avo, La Flor Dominicana, De los Reyes, PDR, and Casa Carrillo all hold importance, yes, but they come later. And La Aurora stands at the beginning of the Dominican origin premium cigar timeline. After La Aurora, the story starts to change shape. The 1800s gave us old Cuban names, European cigar companies, American factory roots, and the first Dominican anchor. But in the early and middle 20th century, the timeline becomes harder to read. This is where families move, factories burn, countries change, tobacco farms are lost, new production homes appear. Some names stay under family control. Some move into larger portfolios. Some become famous in a country that was not their starting point. So, from here on, the dates need even more care. First comes Arturo Fuente. The Fuente story begins in 1912. The legendary founder Arturo Fuente was born in Guinea in Cuba. He moved to Key West in 1906. Then, he settled in West Tampa a few years later. By then, Cuban, Spanish, and Italian cigar families had already helped turn Florida into one of the great cigar-making centers of the United States. In 1912, Arturo Fuente opened A. Fuente and Company in West Tampa. But this was not the Dominican Fuente story yet. This was still a Cuban immigrant story inside the American cigar world that was shaped by the same Florida cigar culture that had already carried so many cigar families into the United States. But that early company did not move smoothly into fame. You see, the Fuente story is more about survival than comfort. In 1924, a fire destroyed the young business. Fuente production shut down for decades. Later, the company restarted in a smaller way. Then Carlos Fuente Sr., Arturo's son, carried the family name forward. By the late 1950s, Carlos Fuente Sr. had become central to the company's direction. And the family slowly began rebuilding the kind of cigar house that smokers recognize today. That is why Fuente carries so much weight. This is the beautiful story of a resilient family that kept restarting. The Dominican chapter comes later. Over time, the Fuente name became tied to Dominican production. It became tied to Dominican tobacco ambition. And it became tied to one of the most important modern achievements in premium cigars. Fuente helped prove that the Dominican Republic could produce great wrapper leaf for a world-class Dominican cigar. And this is where the story moves from family survival into cigar history. You see, for a long time, many people in the cigar world believed the Dominican Republic could grow excellent filler tobacco, but not truly great wrapper. Which sounds like a small technical detail, but it is not. The wrapper is the face of the cigar. It has to be thin. It has to be elastic. It has to burn well. It has to look beautiful. And it has to carry flavor without falling apart in the roller's hands. That was the part many people thought the Dominican Republic could not do at the highest level. Carlito Fuente, however, took that doubt personally. So, in the early 1990s, he began chasing a Dominican wrapper that many people thought was unrealistic. The land that became central to the story was near Bonao in the Dominican Republic, and the farm would become known as Chateau de la Fuente. The Opus X project began under a stranger working name. Project X from Planet 9? Yes, that sounds like a cigar blended by a science fiction fan with access to very good tobacco. But behind the odd name was a serious idea. Could Fuente grow the wrapper in the Dominican Republic, then build an entire premium cigar from Dominican tobacco? The answer became Fuente Opus X. So, when Opus X appeared in 1995, it was not just another expensive cigar in a fancy band. No. This was a Dominican puro. A puro is when the wrapper, binder, and filler of a cigar come from the same country or region. And in this case, the Opus X came from the Dominican Republic. And that alone made it a challenge to old assumptions. But then came the harder test. Smokers had to accept it. Retailers had to believe in it. Critics had to judge it beside the great names people already trusted. And over time, Opus X did something very rare. It became a modern non-Cuban cigar that could sit in the same conversation as Cuba's most respected names. However, that does not mean every smoker had to agree. Cigars are not court verdicts, thankfully. But the public record is clear enough to hold such importance. and in 2005, Cigar Aficionado named the Fuente Opus X Double Corona its Cigar of the Year. That same list placed it ahead of Cuban names like Montecristo, Partagás, Juan López, Bolivar, and Cohiba. Then, almost 2 decades later, it happened again. In 2023, Fuente Opus X Reserva de Chateau was named Cigar Aficionado's #1 cigar of the year. That cigar was made at Tabacalera A Fuente Echia in the Dominican Republic. Its wrapper, binder, and filler were all listed as Dominican. And again, it ranked ahead of Cuban cigars on the same list, including Partagás, Romeo y Julieta, and Rafael González. That is why Opus X holds a great place in the history of premium hand-rolled cigars, for it changed what people believed the Dominican Republic could be. Before Opus X, the Dominican Republic was already important. After Opus X, it could no longer be treated as a country that only supplied part of the blend. Fuente had shown that Dominican soil could produce the wrapper, the strength, the beauty, and the identity of a world-class cigar. And for a family that had survived shutdowns, fire, exile, rebuilding, and decades of uncertainty, that achievement carries a special weight. That is the reason Fuente still burns in this story, because the family kept finding another road. And in the end, their greatest modern cigar helped redraw the map of premium cigars, while carrying the Fuente name forward. Next, Aurora, 1916. The Aurora name is tied to Cuban tobacco roots. Later, it becomes tied to Honduras, Coroco Tobacco, Camacho, CLE, the Aurora brand, and the modern 1916 Tabacalera Aurora identity. But 1916 is not the launch date of CLE or the launch date of the modern Aurora cigar brand. And it is not the launch date of 1916 Tabacalera Aurora as a cigar line. The date belongs to family tobacco roots. That is why the Aurora entry shows us once again how some modern cigar names carry old family memory behind them. Christian Aurora and the modern CLE world, on the other hand, belong to the contemporary cigar market. And so, the family's tobacco identity reaches back much further, with the Aurora story giving Honduras its place in the timeline. You see, when cigar history is told too quickly, Honduras often shows up only as a production country. But the Honduran cigar story goes much deeper than that, as it runs through Cuban exile families, farms, Coroco seed, the Jamastran Valley, and it runs through the search for tobacco that could preserve a certain Cuban-rooted taste outside Cuba. And that is the larger point behind Aurora. Toranio shares that same 1916 space, but its current meaning is different. Santiago Toranio came from Spain to Cuba. Around 1916, he entered the tobacco business, and the family later became one of the important tobacco families in Cuba. Then the revolution changed everything. The family lost its Cuban base and rebuilt through tobacco work in places such as the Dominican Republic and Central America. So, that alone would make Toranio a strong family-rooted entry. But Toranio also shows what happens when a family name becomes a portfolio name. For many smokers, Toranio means Carlos Toranio. It means Exodus. It means Casa Toranio. It means Vault. It means Master Collection. And it means the family-branded New World Cigar period. But in 2014, General Cigar acquired the Toranio brand portfolio. Cigar Aficionado reported the sale clearly. General acquired the brands and took over ownership and distribution. The family company itself entered a winding down phase. So, that changes the way we talk about the name. Nevertheless, Toraniu belongs in our episode's timeline because the family tobacco root is real and old, and because the name stayed present in the cigar market. However, today's Toraniu should not be described as the same independent family cigar company it once was. And now, the Dominican sequence returns with Tabacalera Palma and La Galera. This entry is not as globally famous as Fuente, Padrón, Montecristo, or Cohiba. But historically, it deserves attention, as it fills the space between La Aurora's early Dominican foundation and the later Dominican export boom. What's more interesting is that the Blanco family story reaches further back through agriculture. The Premium Cigar Association, or PCA, coverage traces the family through José Manuel Blanco Losada. He emigrated from Spain to the Dominican Republic in the late 1880s. He worked with crops such as fruit, coffee, cacao, and tobacco. And so, his descendants carried that tobacco work forward. In 1925, José Arnaldo Blanco II established Tabacalera Palma. Then, in 1936, the operation filed for industrial recognition. The modern phase of that history is La Galera. And that modern phase is tied to José Jochi Blanco. And the name itself holds great significance. In cigar language, a galera is the rolling room. So, La Galera points back into the factory. It points to the benches. The rollers, the daily craft, and it points to the place where cigars are actually made. Under Jochi Blanco, Tabacalera Palma became more export-facing. The factory worked on handmade cigars for other brands. Then it gave its own history a public voice through La Galera. That makes Tabacalera Palma different from a brand that begins with marketing, for it is a factory story first, and it is a Dominican production story. Now, we return to Cuba, but to a quieter Habanos name, Rafael Gonzalez. Habanos keeps the date broad and places Rafael Gonzalez in the 1930s. Once again, the safest narration should not force a more precise year unless the source supports it. And while Rafael Gonzalez is not one of the loudest Cuban names, it still has one of the strangest small details in the Habanos portfolio. The brand is tied to the factory name Cervantes. Habanos says this was the brand where the Cervantes Vitola was first called a Lonsdale after Lord Lonsdale. So, that gives Rafael Gonzalez a place in cigar language, with the Lonsdale format becoming a classic size name. Then there is the box lid note. Rafael Gonzalez boxes carry a curious instruction in English. In plain terms, it tells the smoker that the cigars should be smoked within 1 month of shipment from Havana. If not, they should be aged carefully for about a year. Now, that is an oddly specific line to survive on a cigar box. And because it is so specific, it gives the brand character for sometimes. A cigar brand stays alive through one phrase, one size, one label, one little habit that collectors notice, and the small rituals of how smokers read a cigar before they ever light it. Then, in 1935, Montecristo arrives. And here we meet one of the clearest examples of fame arriving later than age. Montecristo is old, yes, but compared with Por Larrañaga, Ramón Allones, H. Upmann, Partagás, Romeo y Julieta, and several other Cuban names, it is young. And that surprises people because Montecristo feels ancient. It feels like it has always been there. Nevertheless, It has become one of the great reference names of Cuban cigars, for it is one of the names even casual smokers recognize. Habanos ties Montecristo to the H. Upmann factory in Havana. Its name comes from Alexandre Dumas' novel The Count of Monte Cristo. The novel was popular with cigar rollers who listened to readings in the factory. And that brings us to one of the most beautiful pieces of cigar culture, the lector. We've dedicated a full chapter to this tradition in our upcoming book on the history of cigars and tobacco. So don't forget to pre-order it if you haven't already. But to give you a general idea, in traditional Cuban cigar factories, a lector read aloud while rollers worked. The reading could include newspapers, political writing, serialized fiction, novels, and other texts. And the rollers listened while their hands kept moving. So, spectacularly, a factory became a workplace, a classroom, a theater, and sometimes a political room. So, Montecristo is charmingly tied to the sound of a book moving through a cigar factory. That gives the brand a different kind of depth. Sancho Panza and Romeo y Julieta gave us older literary naming. Montecristo gives us literature inside the workplace itself. A story read aloud into the rhythm of cigar making. And yet, Montecristo also gives us another split history problem. There is Cuban Montecristo, that it's the Habanos brand with its origin in Havana in 1935, the one we've been talking about all along. Then there are non-Cuban Montecristo lines. Those are connected to Altadis and Dominican production. They include work at Tabacalera de García in La Romana. It belongs to a different legal, commercial, and production context. If we collapse those into one story, we lose the whole point of this episode. One name can carry more than one life in the cigar world. St. Louis Rey comes next. And in some ways, it feels almost like the opposite of Montecristo. Montecristo is famous, but St. Louis Rey is harder to pin down. Habanos says St. Louis Rey was founded before the Second World War. The name itself is uncertain too. Some people connect it to Thornton Wilder's novel, The Bridge of San Luis Rey. That novel was popular around that period, but Habanos says the name is more likely tied to San Luis, which is one of the districts at the center of tobacco culture, in Vuelta a Baco in Pinar del Rio. Then the Dominican Republic enters the story again, with Tabacalera El Artista. Tabacalera El Artista opened in Tamboril in 1956. Its main operations are there. Today, the modern public-facing identity is Artista Cigars, which follows a more recent rebrand. But the factory history goes back much further. Now, Dominican cigar history is often told through famous consumer brands. La Aurora, Fuente, Ashton, Davidoff, La Flor Dominicana, and others get much of the public attention. But factories like El Artista show the production culture underneath that reputation. Besides Tamboril, PCA's coverage also points to other facilities or warehouses in places such as Moca, La Vega, and San Juan. This presents the company as a factory with a strong artisan identity. And that identity is built around people, process, tobacco handling, fermentation, and production work. Next comes Camacho. The Camacho date is usually placed in 1961. Some references use 1962. Cigar Aficionado, however, traces the route to Simon Camacho opening Miami's first cigar factory in 1961. From there, the Camacho name eventually moves into a very different identity. The brand becomes strongly associated with Honduras, especially through the Eiroa family. Cigar Aficionado notes that the Eiroa family purchased the rights to Camacho in the 1990s. Then Davidoff purchased the brand in 2008. That is a remarkable path for one name. It starts with a Cuban exile-era Miami root. It becomes tied to Honduran Coroco and a bolder New World profile. Then it enters the Oettinger Davidoff world. And at that point, Camacho becomes part of a larger international premium cigar portfolio. Then comes Padrón, and here the date is refreshingly clean. Padrón Cigars began in September 1964 in Miami. It was founded by José Orlando Padrón. The official Padrón story gives us one of the strongest origin details in modern cigars. That detail is the little hammer, el martilito. You see, José Padrón arrived in Miami after leaving Cuba. He worked hard, including carpentry work with a small hammer given to him by a friend. And that hammer helped him save the $600 that allowed him to open Padrón Cigars in September 1964. Besides the phenomenal quality that Padrón is known for today, this is another beautiful story that's full of humility and specification. For Padrón does not begin as a giant factory myth, but with a man trying to make a cigar that reminded him of the kind of cigars Cuban exiles could no longer easily find in Miami. Then the Nicaraguan chapter comes in. Padrón later becomes deeply tied to Nicaragua, especially Esteli. It also becomes tied to a style that many smokers associate with richness, consistency, and a stronger Cuban seed profile. But the founding date still belongs to Miami. So Padrón gives us one of the cleanest ways to tell a New World cigar story properly. And come today, this remarkable brand is still one of the strongest family names in premium cigars. And then comes Cohiba. Cohiba was created in 1966. That makes it young compared with the 19th century Cuban names we covered earlier. It is younger than Por Larrañaga, younger than Ramón Allones, younger than H. Upmann, Partagás, Sancho Panza, Hoyo de Monterrey, Romeo y Julieta, La Gloria Cubana, and many others. And yet, for many smokers, Cohiba feels like the summit of Cuban cigar identity. Habanos describes Cohiba as its most prestigious brand. For many years, it was intended as a gift for government personalities, foreign and national, and for Fidel Castro. Since then, it has been made at El Laguito in Havana. The name itself reaches further back in language. Habano says Cohiba is an old Taíno word used for the rolled tobacco leaves seen in Cuba in the earliest European accounts. Yet, that does not make the modern Cohiba brand ancient. Cohiba also became public later. Habano says it became available internationally in limited quantities from 1982. And there is one more caution. We're talking about Cuban Habanos Cohiba here. The non-Cuban Cohiba sold in the United States sits inside a separate trademark and production story tied to General Cigar. The shared name can confuse some viewers. After Cohiba, we need one more post-revolution Cuban name before the wider map accelerates. Diplomáticos. This brand sits in a different Cuban moment from the old 19th century names. Diplomáticos is a post-revolution Habanos brand from the 1960s, commonly cited as 1966. So that makes it young beside the old Cuban core. But young does not mean unimportant, for Diplomáticos shows that Cuba was still creating Habanos brands after the old factory names and old decorated boxes had already entered history. And the key comparison is Montecristo. You see, Habanos says Diplomáticos has a marked resemblance to Montecristo. It also uses numbers instead of names for its sizes. That tells us how strong Montecristo had become by the 1960s. So, a newer brand could borrow the numbered language of an older reference point and become a quieter branch of the Cuban shelf. But that does not make Diplomáticos a fake Montecristo. On the contrary, this makes the relationship part of the story. Its cigars are handmade with long filler. The tobacco comes from Vuelta Abaco, and its profile is officially medium to full. The old line was wider, with several numbered cigars. Over time, it contracted. For years, Diplomáticos No. 2 was the standard production survivor. Then regional editions gave the brand a second collector life. Spain, Asia Pacific, Cuba, Canada, Phoenicia, Switzerland, Germany, Italy, and other markets helped keep the name moving in short bursts. Then, in late 2025, Habanos announced Diplomáticos Cancilleres. That was momentous for the brand because Cancilleres was the first new regular production Diplomáticos in decades. The name means chancellors. And for a brand called Diplomáticos, that finally sounds like the brand speaking in its own vocabulary. So, Diplomáticos belongs here as a smaller Cuban lesson. Cohiba explains prestige. Montecristo explains benchmark status. Diplomáticos explains a younger Habanos brand built in the shadow of an older reference point, then kept alive through narrow production, regional editions, and a new regular production edition. And then comes Trinidad, a name that feels old to many smokers because it carries secrecy, prestige, pigtail caps, and Cuban state memory. But by date, Trinidad is young beside the old Cuban core. The first clock is 1969. That is the Habanos creation date. And the second clock is 1998. That is when Trinidad became available for general sale, in very limited quantities. Those two clocks are the heart of the chapter, because a cigar can exist before the public is allowed to buy it, and a brand can become famous through delay. Now, Habanos says Trinidad, like Cohiba, was used for many years as a gift for foreign diplomats. So, it lived first in a restricted world. The name comes from Santiésima Trinidad, the Cuban city on the southern coast of the island. That gives the cigar a place name identity. But again, the city is much older than the brand, for the city name reaches back centuries. Cigar reporting describes early diplomatic Trinidads in plain cedar boxes. And Habanos says Trinidad was made for several years at El Laguito, the historic Cohiba factory. But the current official production note points to Pinar del Rio. So, again, we hold the details carefully. At first, there was one cigar, Fundadores. These were long, similar to Lanceros, slender, limited, and carrying the feeling of a private cigar finally allowed onto the public shelf. Then the public line expanded in 2003 with Reyes, Coloniales, and Robustos Extra. After that, Trinidad moved through expansions, cuts, limited editions, and anniversary releases. Vigia arrived in 2014 as a shorter, thicker modern edition. And in 2019, for the 50th anniversary, Habanos added Esmeralda, Media Luna, and Topaz to the regular range. Then the 55th anniversary period brought high-end releases, vintage programs, and more collector language around the name. So, this is the strange thing about Trinidad. It began as a hidden cigar. Then it became public. Then it became luxury. There is also a non-Cuban Trinidad story, which belongs to a separate US trademark and production path tied to Altadis USA and other earlier chapters. So, Cuban Trinidad and non-Cuban Trinidad should not be merged. The Cuban Trinidad in this episode is the Habanos brand, created in 1969, gifted for years, made public in 1998, and now used as one of the prestige levers in the Habanos portfolio. Cohiba, it's the mountain. Trinidad is the narrower path beside it. And together, they show that post-revolution Cuban cigar history created brands through secrecy, state gifting, restricted production, delayed public sale, and later luxury presentation. And with that, the early and middle 20th century gives us the full lesson, because from there, the modern premium cigar map starts to accelerate. The year 1968 is crowded. By now, cigar history is no longer moving in one neat lane. The older story was easier to follow. A brand was registered in Havana. A factory opened. A family name moved from one place to another. A plantation became part of a brand identity. But after the 1960s, the map gets busier. Cuba's revolution has already changed the cigar world. The US embargo has changed the market. Cuban families, cigar workers, growers, retailers, and factory owners are rebuilding outside Cuba. The Dominican Republic is becoming even more important. Nicaragua is about to become a serious premium cigar country. Miami is becoming a cigar bridge. And in the United States, new cigar businesses are forming through retail, distribution, accessories, and brand building. So, instead of being one story, the year 1968 is several doors opening at the same time. And the first door is CAO. CAO traces its company roots to Cano Aret Osgener in Nashville, Tennessee in 1968. And by 1968, we're referring to CAO's company history. It is not the launch date of CAO as a premium handmade cigar brand in the way most cigar smokers understand it today. You see, Cano Osgener was born in Istanbul. He came to the United States. Then he built a business in Nashville around objects tied to tobacco culture. That meant pipes, meerschaum, briar, humidors, and accessories. Even the company name came from his initials, CAO. Which is quite interesting because unlike the other brand stories we've spoken about so far, CAO was founded by a Turkish-born engineer and craftsman. The premium cigar identity came later. That switch became clear as the Osgener family moved more seriously into cigars. And over time, CAO became known for a modern, experimental border-crossing style. The brand would eventually become a major name during the premium cigar boom era. Its lines helped smokers pay closer attention to wrappers and origins outside the usual old Cuban framework. Think of Brasilia, Italia, Cameroon, and later global-style blends. CAO made the geography feel like part of the cigar's personality. Then, in 2007, Scandinavian Tobacco Group acquired CAO International. CAO later became part of the wider General Cigar and STG world. So, the modern CAO on the shelf is a once family-led brand identity carried inside a large international cigar portfolio. Now, the next 1968 link is Casa Carrillo, and this one takes a little more care. You see, that date points backward into the Perez Carrillo family's Miami story and into the El Credito story. To understand it, we need to follow Ernesto Perez Carrillo Jr., his father Ernesto Perez Carrillo Sr., and the non-Cuban branch of La Gloria Cubana. The family's cigar roots begin earlier in Cuba. Ernesto Sr. bought a small cigar factory in Havana called El Credito in the 1940s. And after the Cuban Revolution, the family eventually rebuilt its cigar life in Miami. In 1968, El Credito Cigars opened on Calle Ocho in Little Havana, and that placed the family inside the Cuban exile cigar world in the United States. Then La Gloria Cubana enters the story. As we mentioned earlier in the episode, the Cuban La Gloria Cubana is an older Habanos brand from the 1880s. The non-Cuban La Gloria Cubana, on the other hand, is a separate branch. And in the modern American market, that non-Cuban branch becomes tied to El Credito, Miami, Ernesto Perez Carrillo Jr., and later Dominican production. Then there's Casa Carrillo, which is a later company chapter. Ernesto Perez Carrillo Jr. eventually became one of the key figures of the cigar boom. La Gloria Cubana developed a strong following in the United States. It was fuller, bolder, and more characterful than many of the mild cigars that dominated parts of the market at the time. Demand grew, and with that, the small Miami shop could not carry the whole story forever. So, production had to move beyond Miami, and Dominican production became part of the brand's modern life. Then, in 1999, Swedish Match bought El Credito and La Gloria Cubana. Ernesto, however, stayed for a time. Later he left and started a new family company with his children. And that modern chapter begins in 2009. The company was first called EPC Cigar Company, which then became EP Carrillo. Then it moved toward Casa Carrillo as a unified name. The factory in Santiago's Zona Franca was called Tabacalera La Alianza. Later that factory name became Casa Carrillo too. So, if this episode says Casa Carrillo 1968, we have to be exact about what that means, as 1968 is the El Credito Miami route, while 2009 is the modern EPC Cigar Company and Tabacalera La Alianza chapter. And now, the third 1968 story is none other than Joya de Nicaragua. If we are looking for the oldest premium cigar maker established in Nicaragua, Joya de Nicaragua is the anchor. Joya states that it was established in 1968 as Nicaragua's first premium cigar maker. That makes it different from Plasencia and Oliva. Plasencia has older family tobacco roots. Oliva has older family tobacco roots. Their stories later become deeply tied to Nicaragua, yes. But Joya de Nicaragua begins in Nicaragua as a premium cigar manufacturer. And today, Nicaragua is one of the central countries in premium cigars. Esteli is one of the names every serious smoker learns. Many enthusiasts would even consider its significance in the premium cigar world to rival that of Vuelta a Baco, if not surpass it in modern times. After all, Nicaraguan tobacco has a reputation for body, mineral depth, spice, sweetness, and power, depending on the region and the blend, but that reputation did not appear fully formed. Joya de Nicaragua is part of how that identity began. The brand's early years also show how close cigar history and politics can sit. Nicaragua's cigar industry had to live through revolution, war, nationalization, embargo pressure, instability, rebuilding, and later global recognition. Joya de Nicaragua survived enough political and economic disruption to become proof that Nicaragua could make a premium handmade cigar with its own voice, much like Cuba or the Dominican Republic. After Joya, we move back to the Dominican Republic, but now the scale changes. Tabacalera de García represents a scale. The older Dominican origin anchor is La Aurora in 1903, which we spoke about earlier. So, that is the early national foundation. Tabacalera de García, however, is a different kind of power. Its story is usually placed around 1971. Some public anniversary references create a late 1960s shadow around the date. So, for this episode, the careful wording is best treated as 1971, despite some public anniversary language pointing toward a late 1960s frame. The location is La Romana in the Dominican Republic, and the importance is huge. Tabacalera de García became one of the great large-scale handmade cigar factories in the world. Today, it is tied to Altadis. It is also tied to the non-Cuban production lives of famous legacy names such as Montecristo, Romeo y Julieta, H. Upmann, Vega Fina. Other major lines pass through that production world too. Now, what Tabacalera de García gives us is the Dominican industrial chapter of their non-Cuban versions. So, while La Aurora shows how the Dominican Republic had its own cigar origin story, and Fuente, Quezada, Kellner, De los Reyes, La Flor Dominicana, and many others show the family and factory richness of the Dominican cigar world, Tabacalera de García shows the production center story. It shows how the Dominican Republic became one of the global homes of premium cigar manufacturing, not through one boutique bench alone, but through huge systems of aging, sorting, rolling, quality control, export logistics, and brand stewardship. There is romance in cigar history, yes, but there is also infrastructure, warehouses, fermentation rooms, wrapper sorting, free zones, training, skilled rollers, long-term tobacco inventory, brand portfolios, distribution networks, and Tabacalera de García is where the story becomes industrial without becoming impersonal. Because at the end of it, cigars are still made by hands. Macanudo, on the other hand, takes us through a different route. You see, for many American cigar smokers, Macanudo is a very familiar name. It is often associated with a mild premium cigar, Connecticut shade wrapper, and a smooth, approachable profile. But its origin is not Dominican in a clean, simple way, as the name has a winding path. Macanudo began as a front mark, or size name, connected to punch outside the modern Macanudo brand identity. Later, the name became tied to Temple Hall in Jamaica. General Cigar acquired the Temple Hall factory in Kingston in 1969, and that acquisition included Macanudo. From there, General Cigar reworked the brand for the American market. The modern premium Macanudo identity develops around the early 1970s. 1971 is often used as the key modern brand development date. The Dominican chapter comes later. So, Macanudo should not be described as an old Dominican origin brand, yet its importance is still real. And for many US smokers, Macanudo became one of the first premium cigar names they recognized. It helped define a mild, polished Connecticut shade premium cigar experience. It sat on the opposite end of the spectrum from many fuller cigars that became fashionable later. That makes Macanudo useful in this history, even for viewers who prefer stronger cigars today. So, in other words, A brand can hold great significance because it shaped the entry point. It can hold significance because it introduced a generation to premium cigars. And it can also hold significance because it became widely available, consistent, and easy to understand. And Macanudo did just that. Next comes Quesada and Matassa in June of 1974. Here, we get a cleaner Dominican factory story with an older family tobacco background behind it. The story goes that Manuel Quesada, his father Manuel Sr., and his brother Alvaro opened Manufactura de Tabacos S.A., and that company is known as Matassa. They opened it in Santiago, in the Dominican Republic. The Santiago Free Zone places the company inside the Dominican Republic's manufacturing growth. In fact, PCA coverage describes Matassa as the first cigar factory to open in Santiago's Free Zone. The start was small and the resources were limited. Quesada is a factory family story involved in tobacco that turned toward cigar manufacturing. And once the factory grows, it starts making cigars for others. Later, the Quesada name becomes more visible to consumers through lines like Quesada, Casa Magna, and anniversary releases. But the 1974 date is the factory founding date, and not the launch date of the Quesada consumer brand in the modern shelf sense. What's interesting here is that many smokers know the label, yet fewer know the people who are making cigars for other companies, private labels, export markets, or legacy names. So, Quesada gives us a window into that hidden layer. Then the timeline moves into the mid-1980s with Ashton. Now, Ashton is a different kind of story, as it is a modern brand launch that Robert Levin founded in 1985. His background came through retail in Philadelphia. That world was shaped by the cigar business he inherited and expanded through the family's Holtz Cigar Company. And that retail background holds hefty weight here, as Ashton began its journey with a retailer who understood customers, consistency, presentation, and the difference between having good cigars and building a dependable premium brand. Then comes the production relationship that defines Ashton. Levin partnered with the Fuente family, and Ashton became made through Tabacalera de Fuente in the Dominican Republic. That relationship helped place Ashton inside the Dominican premium cigar conversation. But Ashton itself is not a Dominican origin family brand. For its strength, its brand discipline. Ashton built its reputation around consistency, refinement, and a clear house style. The original Ashton line leaned toward accessible Dominican-made elegance. Ashton Cabinet became a major super premium expression later in the 1980s. VSG, which is short for Virgin Sun Grown, gave the brand more body. It also became a reference point for smokers who wanted a richer Ashton profile. But now, let's move over to Avo. Avo is one of the most personality-driven entries in this whole section. The date basis is its 1987 creation and its wider market arrival in 1988. The story begins with Avo Uvezian. He was a musician, composer, pianist, and cigar figure whose name became the brand. So, in other words, his public image, music, dress, dinners, and friendships became part of the cigar's identity. And during his performing years, the story goes that Uvezian would share cigars with people around him. And those cigars became part of his social world. The turning point came when he connected with Hendrik Henke Kellner. Kellner was the Dominican master blender and manufacturer closely tied to Davidoff's later Dominican production whirl. Uvesen and Kellner worked together to create a cigar that carried Avo's name and personality. The first Avo cigar arrived in that late 1980s window. 1988 is commonly used for the wider market expansion. Later, Davidoff became part of the brand's distribution and ownership story. A major distribution rights chapter came in the 1990s. So, once again, what makes AVO different is mood. It sits at the meeting point of music, personality, Dominican blending, and modern premium branding. Unlike Ashton, which feels disciplined and retailer-driven, AVO feels personal and performative. It has tempo built into the story. And so, by this point, we bear witness to the modern premium cigar world take shape. A Turkish-born founder in Nashville builds CAO from company roots into a modern cigar portfolio. A Cuban-American family story moves from El Credito to La Gloria Cubana to Casa Carrillo. A Nicaraguan factory founded in 1968 becomes the country's oldest premium cigar maker. A Dominican factory in La Romana helps carry non-Cuban version of some of the most famous legacy names in the world. A Jamaican-linked brand becomes one of the defining mild premium cigars in the United States market. A Dominican family factory begins in Santiago's free zone with Matassa. A Philadelphia retailer creates Ashton through Fuente production, and a musician named Avo turns personality, music, and Dominican blending into a cigar brand. These few examples showed us how, after 1968, cigar history stops looking like a straight line and starts looking more like a network, with roots in Cuba, factories in the Dominican Republic, brands built in the United States, tobacco from Nicaragua, portfolios owned by international groups, family names that leave one country and rebuild in another. The modern premium cigar map is not simple, but it becomes much more interesting when we stop forcing it to be simple. By the 1990s, the timeline changes speed. The 1990s feel different. This is the era when the premium cigar market starts to feel like a new world opening in real time. Demand rises, new companies appear, old factories get busier. Cigar magazines, ratings, retail culture, and brand personalities begin shaping how smokers discover cigars. And in the middle of all that noise, some brands that once felt young now have more than 30 years behind them. So, when we enter this part of the list, the word oldest changes again. These are modern legacy brands. They are younger than the old Cuban names. They are younger than the 19th century brands. They are younger than the old family tobacco roots from Vuelta a Baco. But they hold great importance because the cigar world most smokers recognize today was shaped heavily by this period. Perdomo begins in August 1992. That is when Nick Perdomo Jr. started Nick's Cigar Company in Hialeah, Florida. Cigar aficionado and Perdomo-linked company coverage plays the beginning there. The company started small, out of a garage, before moving into a larger Miami space as demand grew during the cigar boom. However, this wasn't the beginning of the family's entire relationship with cigars, as Perdomo's father and grandfather had worked in the Cuban cigar industry. So, that family story sits behind the business. But August 1992 is the start of Nick's company. Now, what makes Perdomo important here is the way it grows out of the boom, then survives past it. Many cigar boom brands rose quickly, then disappeared when the market cooled. Perdomo, however, did something else. It moved toward Nicaragua. It built production strength there. And it became known for a more controlled, vertically integrated model. So, for this timeline, that makes Perdomo one of the clearest examples of a 1990s startup becoming a durable cigar company. The Florida to Nicaragua path is part of the larger story too. Miami, Hialeah, and Little Havana were full of Cuban exile cigar memory. Nicaragua offered volcanic soil, tobacco farms, lower production costs, skilled labor, and a premium cigar identity that was still being written. Therefore, Perdomo sits right at that crossing point. Then, a few years later, La Flor Dominicana arrives, and its story feels completely different. In 1994, Lito Gomez and Inés Lorenzo Gomez began making cigars in the Dominican Republic. The early company name was Los Libertadores. The first cigars were not the bold La Flor Dominicana profile many smokers know today. Cigar Aficionado describes the early Los Libertadores cigars as milder. La Flor Dominicana later became the public identity. Then the brand built its reputation around much stronger, more distinctive cigars. We felt this brand belongs in this esteemed list because it shows how fast a younger brand can become part of a country's cigar voice. And as we've learned so far, the Dominican Republic already had deep cigar roots before La Flor Dominicana arrived. La Aurora goes back to 1903. Tabacalera Palma belongs to the 1920s and 1930s. Tabacalera El Artista dates to 1956. Tabacalera de García enters the story in the early 1970s. Quesada follows in 1974. And Fuente has its later Dominican chapter too. So La Flor Dominicana enters after all of that. Yet, it still becomes one of the names people use when they talk about Dominican character. Part of that comes from production. Part of it comes from farming. Part of it comes from personality. Lito Gomez became known for experimentation, Dominican tobacco, stronger blends, and a willingness to challenge the old assumption that Dominican cigars had to be mild. The La Canela farm becomes part of that identity, which holds great meaning in this lovely story because the brand is shaping its own tobacco story, rather than simply borrowing a finished image from the outside. De Los Reyes Cigars follows in 1995, and this entry should move more quietly. Industry and company-related profiles describe De Los Reyes as a Dominican family-run premium cigar company with a much older tobacco tradition behind it. ARV Group's profile places the company's foundation in 1995. Cigar coverage and PCA interview material point to several generations of Reyes family tobacco work. The brand universe includes Saga, Don Julio, Debonair production work, and private label relationships. So, this is not the kind of entry that gets the same casual name recognition as Padrón or Fuente. But for this episode, it is useful because it represents another layer of Dominican cigar history, as some cigar companies become famous because the brand name is everywhere, while others hold significance because they sit behind many cigars, farms, blends, and family operations that serious smokers eventually discover. And De Los Reyes belongs to that second world. Its story is about continuity, family control, tobacco purchasing, Dominican agriculture, and the careful move from factory work toward a stronger house identity. In many ways, a family can have generations in tobacco, but that does not make the consumer company 160 years old. Then Rocky Patel enters the picture through Indian Tabak. Cigar Aficionado places Rocky Patel's early cigar involvement around Indian Tabak in 1996. Other histories use the 1995 to 1996 window for the launch and public trade show appearance. Rocky Patel Premium Cigars, as the front-facing company name, comes later. Cigar Aficionado notes the name change to Rocky Patel Premium Cigars in 2002. Official Rocky Patel material ties the later Tavicusa factory in Esteli to 2008. Some sources describe the factory timeline in slightly different mid-2000 terms. So, the later story, which is the story we know today, places Rocky Patel as a personality-driven premium cigar company. And while older cigar history often follows founders, farms, factories, and family names, Rocky Patel follows a different path, for it is the story of a tireless public-facing owner, constant retailer relationships, trade show growth, and a brand that slowly becomes a global shelf presence. Rocky Patel is not old like H. Upmann or La Aurora, but in the modern premium cigar market. A brand that begins in the 1990s and stays active across decades has earned its place in the timeline, just like Perdomo and La Flor Dominicana. Now, once Rocky Patel enters the 1990s through Indian Tabak, another late boom American story belongs beside it, Alec Bradley. This one begins in 1996, and the label is clean. 1996 is a brand launch and company route. Alan Rubin came into cigars from outside the old cigar dynasties, for he did not inherit a tobacco farm, nor did he inherit a famous factory or have a century-old cigar label behind him. No. He entered during a difficult moment. The premium cigar boom had created demand. It had also created noise. Too many brands, too much excitement, too little patience once the market cooled. So, a company founded in 1996 had to survive the room after the party started ending. The name Alec Bradley came from Rubin's two sons, Alec and Bradley, which created a lasting small confusion, as there was no one person named Alec Bradley running the company. The name was a father's gesture. Later, Alec and Bradley Rubin became part of the next generation story. But the original clock belongs to Alan Rubin's company and brand launch. Now, the early chapter was not smooth. Some first ideas did not work. Golf course cigar concepts and early experiments did not create the lasting identity. Then Alec Bradley found a better path through premium retailers, contract manufacturing and production partners. Occidental Reserve helped the company survive. Trilogy gave it an early visual memory through a triangular press. Max X followed in 2005 and leaned into the larger ring moment. But the major breakthrough came in 2007, Tempos. Tempos helped Alec Bradley move beyond survival. It gave the company a stronger, fuller cigar identity. It also tied the brand closely to Raíces Cubanas in Honduras, one of the factories that shaped the Alec Bradley story. Then came 2009. Family Blend arrived, and so did Prensado. Prensado became the brand's public validation, and in 2011, the Prensado Churchill was named Cigar Aficionado's Cigar of the Year. That award changed the way the cigar world looked at Alec Bradley. But the award also brought pressure. Demand rose, quality and supply had to be managed, and the company had to become more than the maker of one famous Churchill. So, Black Market gave Alec Bradley a darker, more visual modern identity. Fine and Rare gave it a limited release identity. Project 40, Magic Toast, Kintsugi, Gatekeeper and other lines later showed the brand trying different lanes without pretending to be old. Then the ownership clock changed. In 2023, Scandinavian Tobacco Group acquired Alec Bradley, which then placed the company inside a much larger portfolio whirl. And in 2026, the 30 years anniversary cigar gave the brand a neat modern legacy marker. Drew Estate begins in that same broad period, but it changes the mood of the whole section. The official Drew Estate story places the company's birth in 1995. It begins under the Manhattan Bridge in Brooklyn's Dumbo neighborhood. Jonathan Drew Sen and Marvin Samel opened a tiny cigar kiosk in the World Trade Center in downtown Manhattan. Then, the story moves through Miami. The decisive change comes in 1998, when Jonathan Drew moves to Nicaragua and opens Drew Estate's first factory in Esteli. That 1998 move signifies as much as the 1995 company route, as Drew Estate brings a different kind of energy into cigars. It brings New York street culture, subculture language, art, graffiti, event culture, and a willingness to break the visual rules that premium cigars had inherited. Now, for some traditional smokers, that was disruptive. But for a younger generation, it made cigars feel a little less closed off. After all, Nicaragua's modern premium cigar identity was built by farmers, factory owners, rollers, families, and newer companies willing to take risks in Esteli. So, while families like Plasencia and Oliva had already tied their modern identities to Nicaraguan tobacco, Drew Estate helped make Esteli feel like a cultural center for a new kind of cigar audience. Afterward, AGANORSA Leaf enters the New World cigar scene in 1998. Here, the story is less about one cigar brand and more about the soil beneath many brands. The official AGANORSA story says Eduardo Fernandez went to Nicaragua in 1998. His goal was to grow tobacco that captured the character of older Cuban cigars. The company says he traveled to Cuba and gathered a team of Cuban agronomists with deep Cuba tobacco experience. He then brought that team to Nicaragua to work with Cuban seed tobacco under Nicaraguan conditions. So, the result becomes AGANORSA Leaf, which is a vertically integrated tobacco and cigar ecosystem. Now, the beauty of this brand is that it explains something brand lists often miss, for a lot of cigar history is hidden behind the band. Smokers may know Tatuaje, Ilusione, Warped, HVC, Foundation, or other boutique names. But behind many of those cigars is a web of farms, seed work, tobacco sorting, fermentation, factory relationships, and agronomy. And AGANORSA gives this episode a way to talk about that hidden layer. But it's worth noting that the year 1998 does not mean every AGANORSA branded cigar line began that year. In simple terms, the tobacco project begins there. And in modern cigar history, that may mean a lot more than a brand launch. After all, a strong tobacco ecosystem can shape dozens of brands at once. After AGANORSA gives us the soil beneath many modern Nicaraguan cigars, Another name has to enter before Tatuaje, A.J. Fernandez. Now, this is not an old brand in the 19th century sense, for it is a modern factory, farming, blending and production story. And it has become one of the major forces in the premium cigar world. The first working date is 2003. That is when A.J. Fernandez left Cuba for Nicaragua and began his modern Nicaraguan production chapter. The next major date is 2010. That is when San Lotano becomes the first major owned brand chapter. The San Lotano name reaches back through Fernandez family memory in Cuba. Fernandez was born in Cuba and raised around tobacco in Pinar del Rio. His father and uncle worked inside Cuba's tobacco world. As a boy, he spent time around farms after school. Now, although that gives the story its training ground, we need to be very clear. A Cuban-born maker does not make this a Cuban brand. A Nicaraguan cigar made by a Cuban-born maker remains a Nicaraguan production story. When Fernandez arrived in Nicaragua, the country already had cigar weight. Joya de Nicaragua had been there since 1968. Plasencia and Oliva had deep Nicaraguan chapters. Drew Estate had moved into Esteli in 1998. AGANORSA began building its tobacco system in that same year. So, A.J. Fernandez entered that map as a maker, not first as a famous consumer brand. And that is an important distinction that we should be aware of. You see, some companies begin with a name and then search for production. But A.J. Fernandez built production credibility first. Then, the visible portfolio followed. By the late 2000s, Fernandez was already appearing behind other people's cigars. Rocky Patel Projects, online retail cigars, and partner work helped build the factory's reputation. Then, San Lotano gave him a public brand of his own. San Lotano Ovo followed in 2011 and gave the line a shape identity. New World arrived in 2014 and brought his father Ismael into the public portfolio story. Enclave followed in 2015, Belas Artes in 2016, Dias de Gloria in 2019. And each line added another piece of the A.J. Fernandez language. Nicaraguan regions, hybrid wrappers, family memory, Cuban reference points, Brazilian Mata Fina, Cameroon binder, San Andres, and factory control. The scale is part of the story too. The official A.J. Fernandez material says the company owns and operates 2 cigar factories in Nicaragua. Tabacalera A.J. Fernandez in Esteli, and the San Lotano factory north of Esteli. It also says those factories can craft more than 100,000 handmade cigars per day. But A.J. Fernandez is also behind other brands. Southern Draw, Foundation Projects, Ramón Allones by A.J. Fernandez, H. Upmann by A.J. Fernandez, Romeo y Julieta, Nicaragua by A.J. Fernandez, Punch Diablo, Montecristo 1935, Anniversary Nicaragua, Trinidad Espiritu Miami Edition. All those names have their own ownership and brand stories. So, we do not fold them into A.J. Fernandez as if they were all the same thing. Instead, they show how much trust the wider industry has placed in his factories, blends, and tobacco systems. But then came a very current chapter. On March 31st, 2025, a fire damaged the Esteli factory. Reports said there were no injuries, but millions of finished cigars were estimated to have been damaged. Then, in 2026, A.J. Fernandez launched Amar, a new regular production line tied in, reporting to the support that followed the fire, and to Fernandez's Cuban and Lebanese heritage. So, that is still a new chapter. And speaking of Tatuaje, this memorable brand arrives in 2003, and this is when the boutique era starts to come into focus. Pete Johnson launched Tatuaje in 2003. Cigar Aficionado ties that beginning to Johnson's close work with the Garcia family. Another Cigar Aficionado piece explains his relationship with Jose Pepin Garcia during the same period. By then, Garcia had established El Rey de los Habanos in Miami. So, he became Johnson's production partner. The word tatuaje means tattoo in Spanish. That fits Pete Johnson's own visual identity. But beyond style, the brand became a marker for a specific boutique cigar movement. Smaller batches, sharper identity, Cuban-inspired blending ideas, and a close connection between a brand owner and a respected cigar-making family. Tatuaje also helps explain the early 2000s switch toward Nicaraguan-made cigars. The first chapter includes Miami and Garcia production. Then the wider Garcia family story expands into Nicaragua through My Father, which is a remarkably spectacular brand on its own. Think of Tatuaje as a bridge that connects the post-boom market to the boutique market. Not long after, PDR Cigars enters in 2004 from Tamboril in the Dominican Republic. The official PDR site says its doors opened in 2004. And PDR holds weight here, because by this point in the episode, Nicaragua is starting to dominate the modern conversation. So, while Perdomo, Drew Estate, AGANORSA, Tatuaje, and later My Father can make us feel as though every news story runs through Esteli, PDR interrupts that pattern. It brings us back to the Dominican Republic. More specifically, it brings us back to Tamboril, that town with deep cigar-making culture. And we're also reminded that Dominican cigar history did not freeze after La Aurora, Fuente, Quesada, Ashton, Avon, or La Flor Dominicana, but rather newer factories kept opening, new owners and blenders kept entering, and the Dominican map kept moving. Then Illusione arrives in 2006 through Dion Giolito, and the energy changes again. Cigar Aficionado's profile of Dion Giolito describes the core Illusione line, later known as Original Documents. That line was built around Coroco C tobacco grown on the San Jose farm in Nicaragua. Early production history also moved through Raíces Cubanas in Honduras. Later lines and references connect Illusione to Casa Fernandez, AGANORSA related tobacco, and AGANORSA related production. So, in certain ways, Illusione is modern, but it feels old in a very specific way, not by date, but by mood. And the brand's appeal comes from restraint, memory, and a search for an earlier Nicaraguan flavor idea. Yet, it enters the story like someone opening a drawer of old documents, then trying to recover a taste that nearly disappeared. And that is why Illusione is useful for this episode, as it shows that modern cigar history can look backward without pretending to be ancient. Now, although we briefly mentioned My Father Cigars, this outstanding brand deserves a closer look, because its story follows two dates. The first when Jaime Garcia developed the original My Father blend in 2008. And the second is when the Garcia family moved the operation to a larger factory and farm in Esteli in 2009. They named the factory My Father Cigars S.A. after Jaime's blend. And behind those dates is a longer Garcia family story, with Jose Pepin Garcia bringing Cuban cigar-making knowledge into the American and Nicaraguan premium market. Jaime Garcia then became a major blender in his own right. Then, as we talked about earlier, the family story moves through Miami, private label production, Tatuaje, and then a larger Nicaraguan operation. And the Nicaraguan operation became one of the defining factories of the modern era. My father also shows how quickly a modern name can become central. Compared with most of this episode, my father is young, but by influence, it feels much older. So, many modern cigar conversations pass through the Garcia family and Esteli. Warped then appears in 2009 as Kyle Gellis's boutique brand. Cigar Aficionado describes Gellis as one of the younger brand owners in the cigar industry. It also notes that he started Warped in 2009 while studying marketing. The same profile places Warped's production across partners such as El Titan de Bronze in Miami and Tabza in Nicaragua for different lines. Now, Warped works differently from a single factory, single country, old family story, as it is a modern brand identity built through taste, design, restraint, and carefully chosen production partners. But it also reflects a change in how cigar smokers discover brands. So, by the 2000s and the 2010s, a small brand could build a following through limited releases, sharp design language, online cigar communities, boutique retailers, and cigar media. Like we keep saying, a brand did not need a century behind it to feel serious. It needed consistency, it needed a clear point of view, and it needed enough control to make the smoker trust the next release. Warped brings a design-conscious voice into the Nicaraguan linked map. HVC follows in 2011. Rainier Lorenzo founded HVC as a tribute to Havana City, his hometown. Cigar profiles and production coverage placed the brand in Miami with strong Nicaraguan links. Those links include Tabza and AGANORSA related production in earlier years. Half-wheel coverage of HVC. La Rosa 520, for example, describes a cigar made at Tabza in Esteli. That cigar used tobaccos from the Tabza affiliated AGANORSA operation. HVC is one of the clearest examples of Cuban memory expressed through non-Cuban tobacco. The name points back to Havana. The production map points to Nicaragua. The founder's personal story gives the brand its emotional center. And that is exactly the kind of layered identity this episode has been tracking from the start. However, a Cuban memory does not automatically make a cigar Cuban. Yet, a Nicaraguan-made cigar can still be built around Cuban reference points. It can carry Cuban places, Cuban flavor ideals, and Cuban family experience. So, HVC lives in that space. Then, in 2012, Espinosa and La Zona take us deeper into Esteli's small factory culture. Eric Espinosa had already been active in the cigar business before this point. Half-Wheel's profile notes that he had been part of EO brands with Eddie Ortega. That earlier work included brands such as 601 and Murcielago. Then came the split. In 2012, Espinosa started his own company. He also started the La Zona factory in Esteli, Nicaragua. Cigar Aficionado's later conversation with Espinosa also has him placing the La Zona move around 2012. La Zona here holds significance, as it is a factory identity. So, by the 2010s, Esteli was no longer only a place where established companies had factories. for it had also become a place where smaller owners could build production homes of their own. And La Zona became one of those homes. It was a factory for Espinosa's own cigars. It also became a place for boutique work tied to a specific workshop culture. Roma Craft and Nica Sueño belong to the same 2012 wave. Their story has an even more direct small factory feel. The Roma Craft name comes from Michael Rosales and Skip Martin. Half Wheel's launch coverage says Rosales and Martin worked together in 2011 to build Fábrica de Tabacos Nica Sueño in Esteli. The Roma Craft tobacco launch follows in 2012. The brand's early identity was closely tied to Cro-Magnon. It was also closely tied to small batch production in Nicaragua. We felt this was important because it feels like the opposite of the old corporate portfolio model. Roma Craft sits close to the bench. It sits close to the factory. It sits close to the blend. And it sits close to the owner's hands. It enters the timeline as a small brand built around intensity, transparency, and factory connection. But we should again be mindful of the relation between Roma Craft and Nica Sueño. They are not the same thing. The brand identity and the factory identity overlap, but they should not be folded into one simple founding claim. Next, Black Label Trading Company's story begins in 2013. Then Fábrica Oveja Negra opens in 2015. PCA coverage says Black Label Trading Company was launched by James and Angela Brown in 2013. The Oveja Negra factory site explains that starting their own factory in 2015 was a natural next step. That factory gave them more creative control and more ownership over the process. Black Label's place in the list comes from the way the Browns turn cigars into something with an art studio mood. The brand language is darker, it is more visual, it is more experimental, and it is less tied to the old heritage house format. Then, the factory gives that identity a physical home in Esteli. So, visually and historically, Black Label shows the boutique movement maturing. Fratello too enters the story in 2013 through Omar de Frias, a former NASA analyst. Tobacco business coverage adds that the launch involved Joya de Nicaragua production for the Fratello Clásico. And later coverage shows Fratello using La Aurora for Fratello Oro. Fratello is important here because it brings a very different founder background into the story. A former NASA analyst is not the usual cigar origin story. He is not a 19th century Cuban factory owner. He is not a Dominican family factory heir. He is not a Nicaraguan farmer. Instead, he comes from a technical and analytical world. Then he builds a cigar brand through partnerships with established factories. That is a very modern cigar path. And Fratello also shows how a new brand can borrow stability from old factories without pretending to be old itself. So, while Joya de Nicaragua gives one production chapter and La Aurora gives another, the brand remains young. But its manufacturing partners carry deep history. A year later, Southern Draw comes in 2014 through Robert and Sharon Holt. Southern Draw is usually read as a modern American family brand with a strong Nicaraguan production relationship. That relationship is especially tied to A.J. Fernandez for early and core lines. Cigar Advisor describes Robert Holt as a U.S. Army veteran and founder. It also describes A.J. Fernandez as blending cigars for Southern Draw. Southern Draw belongs here because it shows how much the boutique era has relied on strong production partnerships, as we just saw with Fratello, and as we still see today in newer international projects such as Amarati in Dubai, Highclere Castle Cigars, Freud Cigar Company, and Lampert Cigars. So, some modern brands never built a factory, but they do build a voice, a customer base, a set of blends, all done through close relationships with strong manufacturers. In Southern Draw's case, A.J. Fernandez's Nicaraguan production gave the brand a foundation. Robert and Sharon Holt gave it a personal identity built around family, service, and a direct connection with retailers and smokers. That kind of relationship is a modern cigar structure. Dunbarton Tobacco and Trust arrives in 2015. And it enters with a founder who already had real history in the cigar world. Steve Saka established Dunbarton Tobacco and Trust in 2015, after spending years in the cigar business. The official Dunbarton page says Saka worked for Lou Rothman as a consultant. It then says he served as president and later CEO of Drew Estate from 2005 through 2013. Then, in 2015, he founded Dunbarton Tobacco and Trust. The same official page says its cigars are made at Joya de Nicaragua and Nicaragua American Cigar S.A. in Esteli. And that makes Dunbarton unusual in this list, as the company is young. But the founder's influence is older. Saka had already helped shape cigar media, cigar writing, blending conversation, and Drew Estate's rise before launching his own company. So, when Dunbarton appears in 2015, feels like a new chapter for a figure whose earlier work had already shaped the market. And finally, Foundation Cigar Company also begins in 2015. Launched by Nicolas Melillo, Foundation's first cigar, El Güeguense, debuted in that same year. That cigar was made at Tabza in Nicaragua. Halfwheel's launch coverage gives more detail on that first release, which tells us that El Güeguense was a Nicaraguan puro. It used AGANORSA tobacco from Jalapa, Esteli, and related Nicaraguan growing areas. El Güeguense takes its name from one of Nicaragua's major cultural works. The name is often translated as the wise man. Melillo's own background holds significance here too. Before Foundation, he had already worked in Nicaragua. He was already known for production and tobacco sourcing. Foundation's official site frames the company around old world tradition, modern craft, and Melillo's long tobacco experience. So, once again, a brand can be young and still take history seriously. But that does not make it old or move it higher in the ranking. And it does not give it a fake heritage date. But it does show where cigar history keeps going. From Perdomo's Hialeah garage to La Flor Dominicana's tamboril factory. From De Los Reyes family tradition to Rocky Patel's Indian tabac roots. From Drew Estate in New York kiosk to Esteli. From AGANORSA's farms to the boutique brands it helped support. From Tatuaje, Illusione, Warped, HVC, Espinosa, Roma Craft, Black Label, Fratello, Southern Draw, Dunbarton, and Foundation. This final period tells us something important. That the cigar world did not stop making history when the old Cuban names were born. That the cigar world kept changing through garages, kiosks, farms, factories, small rooms in Esteli, Dominican rolling floors, Miami relationships, family businesses, trade shows, and boutique brands with very specific ideas. And that is why the modern entries belong here. So, While they may not be the oldest in the world, they are old enough now to show us what the next layer of cigar history looks like. Two entries are worth keeping outside the strict ranking. The first is Quintero, a current Habanos brand with a distinctive origin outside Havana. Habanos links the brand to Agustin Quintero and Cienfuegos, the Pearl of the South. But the official page we checked did not give a clean founding year. So, the fair move is to treat Quintero as a current Cuban caution entry. The second one is General Cigar Dominicana, which is similar, but in a different way. It may hold some sort of importance to the Dominican manufacturing map, and it may help explain how brands such as Macanudo, CAO, La Gloria Cubana, and other non-Cuban lines became linked to Dominican production. But General Cigar Dominicana, it's a production operation and a portfolio context entry. It is not a consumer brand's founding date. Therefore, these two examples are useful because they show the discipline behind the episode. In other words, sometimes the right historical move is to leave a name unranked. So, what is the oldest cigar brand in the world still made today? That depends on which clock we are using. If we use the active research base for this episode, the oldest verified entry is Toscano. Its origin story begins in Florence in 1815. Its market release follows in 1818. But if we ask for the oldest current Cuban Habanos brand, the answer becomes Por Larrañaga in 1834. And if we ask for one of the oldest active non-Cuban family tobacco lineages connected to today's premium market, then Plasencia and Oliva move near the top. And if we ask for the oldest Dominican origin brand and factory, La Aurora leads that story in 1903. And if we ask for the first premium cigar maker established in Nicaragua, Joya de Nicaragua gives the clean answer in 1968. And that is the whole lesson today. Cigar history is a layered map of families, factories, brands, retailers, farms, migrations, national histories, and portfolio changes. And while Cuba is central to that map, the map does not end in Cuba. It runs through Italy, Germany, Switzerland, the United States, the Dominican Republic, Honduras, Nicaragua, and far, far beyond. Some names are old because the brand is old. Some are old because the company is old. Some are old because the family has been with tobacco for generations. And some are young by date, yet already part of the modern cigar story. That is what makes this subject worth telling. The oldest cigar brands still burning today are lovely clues, for they show us how cigar culture traveled, changed, rebuilt, and remembered itself.